Watch this vidcast, or I'll gouge your eyes out.
Welcome back, Horror Hounds, to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show Podcast.
I am Mike Ghostman Pickle.
And I'm James Rivera. On today's podcast, we're going to be continuing our countdown of our top 50 horror movies of all time. Me and Mike each made our own separate list. We started last week when we counted down 50 through 26.
To celebrate our 50th episode.
Yes, to celebrate the 50th podcast. Now we're going to continue with the top 25 between each of us.
We tried to squeeze all 50 into that 50th podcast, but it's just not possible.
Yes, it would have been an insane length.
Horror show exclusive.
I'm going to start. My number 25 film is The Brood from David Cronenberg, 1979. One of the reasons that it's on my list, it's definitely one of the strangest concepts I've ever seen put on film. It's about a therapist who starts a new program to deal with inner rage and anger, and this program is called Psychoplasmics. It's a program, and this is in the description, encouraging patients with mental disturbances to let go of their suppressed emotions through physiological changes to their bodies. It's a very weird movie because it doesn't have a typical horror villain in any sense, and the only character that you would consider the villain, who is the doctor, played by the magnificent Oliver Reed. He plays Dr. Hal Raglan. So what happens in this therapy is all of the emotional trauma that you carry in you is let out through physical manifestations, and it comes out in very unhealthy ways. Some characters end up getting cancer. They end up getting weird lumps on their bodies. Dr. Hell's greatest experiment is on a woman named Nola, played by Samantha Eggar. She is going through a divorce with her husband, Frank. The movie deals with all the inner rage that comes with dealing with a divorce, the trauma behind it, how the children deal with it, who's going to get to keep custody, and she stays with the doctor to become his ultimate experiment, and she gives birth to rage babies. Each baby that she gives birth to is a manifestation of a different anger or a different emotion that she has, whether it's anger at her child for the way that it's ruined her marriage, whether it's anger at her husband. And these rage babies that she gives birth to, while they are physical manifestations of all her suppressed anger and her suppressed rage, they act on her suppressed rage subconsciously. So she doesn't realize that every time she gives birth to a rage demon, the little baby, or whatever you want to call it, will actually carry out aggressive, hostile actions towards whoever brought on the physical torment in the first place. The emotional torment turned physical, actually. And the main character, played by Oliver Reed, actually believes that he's doing something for the greater good, that he believes that this is the future of therapy, and it's how people are going to deal with their trauma and repressed anger in the future, by letting it out physically. And the movie illustrates how dangerous that concept would be, that if your angers were manifested in the form of a living creature, it would start taking in very, very ways. And the way that these babies are born is pretty disturbing, and I can't even begin to describe the image that Cronenberg. But it's Samantha Eggers, and you see, I don't know, it's like a sack that's connected to her belly that looks pregnant.
Yeah. And
out of these sacks, these gross little creatures come out, and she licks them. It's a pretty fucking gross movie, and it really explores body horror in a really original way. And of course, David Cronenberg is the king of body horror. Yeah. It also deals with child abuse, which is another interesting theme, and about the effect that a divorce would have on a child. David Cronenberg wrote it while he was going through his own divorce, very personal. A lot of people have read the film into being misogynistic. I don't think those interpretations are entirely wrong, because it has to do with the idea that a woman's rage manifested could be extremely dangerous. Whether or not it's wrong or it's right, it is a piece of art because it's coming from a very personal place. Whether the feelings are misguided, it opens up David Cronenberg's imagination in a very positive way. So I think that's what's good about it, is it's a film that almost works as therapy for David Cronenberg. Instead of taking it out in a very unhealthy way on his wife, who he was going through a divorce with, he took it out by creating a story, a fantastical story, about rage demons. So it's a very original way to deal with trauma, to deal with the idea of child abuse, the emotional implications that come with the divorce, and it's just a very unique work. It's very creepy, very unusual, probably David Cronenberg's most original concept. The last 15 minutes are some of the best scenes I've ever seen in a horror movie. The way that the images are presented are very shocking. They're gross, but they stick out in your brain. And for that reason, The Brood is number 25 on my list. One of my favorite David Cronenberg films.
And that was one of the many Cronenberg films where he tackled the theme of rage. And it's one of his best. I had a new appreciation for it. The only reason why it's not on my list, before I seen it this last time at the Cronenberg Marathon, I got a new appreciation for that one because I always just considered it a dirty little movie that I never got truly engaged in, and I didn't get the full effect of the story because it was just, to me, it was just a story about these little rage demons running around. But then when I got the layers of it and the implications of the whole story and how rage is woven throughout, how that's manifested in different ways, and how he
uses body horror to explore these themes.
Yeah, and he uses the story and plot points to address it too.
In that regard, I think it's a very misunderstood film because a lot of people at the time just considered it schlocky exploitation or trashy. What's interesting about it is you could actually appreciate it on that level if you want, because it is kind of trashy and it's schlocky and it certainly has exploitation elements to it, but it's an art film dressed up as an exploitation film. It's an art house horror movie, and it deals with trauma in a very unique and original way. I think it was Roger Ebert at the time said, "No, who would be interested in something this reprehensible?" Yeah. And a lot of people had moral outrage. One critic for the Vancouver Sun, I believe, went on to claim that the people who made this movie, they hate people. They probably don't even like themselves. This is an awful piece of trash.
Shut your mouth or I'll rip your lips off.
I've always took that as a very snobby view. This is a movie that took a long time for the layers that are underneath the story to finally reveal itself. And I think a lot of people didn't like it at the time because it confronted them with certain themes that they didn't even know that they were being confronted. No movie causes that kind of outrage if it doesn't hit a nerve. There are plenty of schlocky films out there. There are plenty of movies that are a lot trashier than The Brood that did not piss off or enrage critics as much as this one. Yeah. And I think it's because it hits a personal note that is hard to put your finger on, especially seeing it only one time. A lot of the themes of the movie could fly over your head, and a lot of the subtleties of what's going on underneath the story might be hard to grasp on a first viewing. So you definitely have to see it a few times to really appreciate the full scope of the emotional layers in the movie.
Sometimes when an old movie is remastered, it can kind of kill the aesthetic that you liked about it, like with Maniac. But I think it was the opposite with this one. And when this one was remastered, it made me appreciate it that much more because I considered it a dirty little movie because I was used to seeing it on VHS. And then I watched it once or twice when it went to DVD, and it wasn't much better. And then the remaster really lets you feel the full impact of the story. And Cronenberg's movies can really hold up to that fine remaster.
Hi, I'm Elliot. You're listening to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
And my number 25 is a groundbreaking masterpiece classic, Night of the Living Dead from 1968, written and directed by George A. Romero, co-written by John A. Russo. It's still scary to this day. It creeps me out every time I watch it. It never gets old, no matter how many times you've seen it. I've seen it countless times. It's one of the best endings in horror history. It started a new subgenre. Zombies were already around in White Zombie with Bela Lugosi and ones like that, where it was voodoo zombies.
Or I Walked with the Zombie. They weren't flesh-eating creatures that arose from the dead. They were animated re-corpses caused by black magic or voodoo.
Yeah, this is a new subgenre, a new zombie that was created by George Romero himself, and it became so popular that it's flooded the horror market to this day. And this is what started it all. It's a new zombie folklore that just took the world by storm. It's one of horror's most beloved treasures, and when you go back and watch it, no matter how many times, it's still just as beloved as it ever was. It's creepy, it's atmospheric, it's got that great social commentary that we grew to love through the rest of George Romero's work.
It's kind of the ultimate midnight movie. And it's interesting that what you said about him starting a new type of zombie, the new folklore. In this movie, they're referred to as ghouls or marauding ghouls, and George Romero actually said at the time that he didn't even know that what he was creating were zombies. As far as he was concerned, they were completely original creations. And then people started applying the term zombie to it, probably because it's the closest word that somebody could think of for a reanimated corpse. And the ghouls eventually changed to zombies, and then later on in the films you get to hear them referred to as zombies. I can see how this would have freaked people out in 1968. The level of gore that's in this movie it's tamed by today's standards, but in 1968 it must have been shocking. And I think the black and white does help.
Almost every scene in it has iconic imagery that was burned into our brains from the moment we watched it, and still to this day, it's burned into every new horror fan's brain, because this is one of the first.
For you, Barbara.
Yeah, this is one of the first movies you watch when you become a horror fan.
In 1968, when it came out, it had to go through kind of like it wasn't released in a wide release. It was so low budget and such a small scale that there are a certain amount of film prints that traveled around the country, and it sort of gained a reputation as a midnight movie because the kids would go see it and everybody would be freaked out and running for the exits when they saw the zombies come and attack. I don't think there had ever been depicted on film before, people being feasted on or body parts being ripped apart. It must have been pretty macabre for the time for people to be seeing that level of gore in a movie.
Or people rising from the dead in mass.
You would think that a concept like this would have existed before Night of the Living Dead. Even though it was a long time ago, it just seems so obvious that why didn't anybody think of this concept before?
Yeah, that's why it's so groundbreaking, because it seems like this idea floated out there for years, and just Romero was the first one to grab it. And I love the way he capitalized on it from every movie after that, because the whole gamut of the Dead films
series
are awesome.
As good as his whole series is, I still think this is the best one because it has a very unique energy that's kind of rock and roll that's not found in his later zombie movies. The sort of do-it-yourself aesthetic, and when you're watching it, you get the feeling that it was a team of rebels who were going out there to try to make the most exciting, interesting movie possible, with very little polish, very little production value, and what they pulled off was something very special and unique. The later Dead movies were a little bit more polished in their productions, and they explored some of the social commentary even further, but none of them have that outsider rebel energy that the original Night of the Living Dead has. The atmosphere that it has is unique, and it's not like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I would have compared it to something like that.
Yeah.
The conditions under which it was made under can never be repeated again on film. You can never fully capture the magic of what Night of the Living Dead is like. Still a great movie to this day, and not just one of the great horror movies of all time, one of the great movies of all time, and one of the great movies of the 1960s.
It's a perfect example of what horror is all about. It's one of the few films that define what horror is.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll gut you.
So my number 24 movie is something that I did not expect to make my list, and it's another one that's actually fairly new, because most of my films on this list consist of stuff that I've watched over and over, or older films, because I feel like it takes a while for something to become a favorite film of mine. I need to get over the initial reaction to them. My number 24 movie is a movie from this year. It is called Loose.
Oh, wow.
And we've actually reviewed it on the podcast about I'd say a couple months ago. Loose is about a cab driver from Chile who lives in Germany who is being chased by a demon or demonic entity that is hopping from body to try to possess Luce because she's in love with her. More than any other film I've seen, it puts the viewer directly inside the experience of being possessed by a demon. It's disorienting, it's frightening, it's bizarre, and it's more than a little confusing. It does this by hypnotizing the viewer with its slow and confounding, but very mesmerizing style into a trance-like state that makes you feel like you're going through what the main character Luce is going through. The bulk of the film revolves around an interrogation sequence where a demon, using the body of a therapist, hypnotizes Luce into a trance-like state to try to take over her body and possess her and slowly insinuate itself into her. We experience this ritual the way that Luce experiences it. We get to feel what it's like to be directly inside the experience of having a demon trying to possess your body and take it over. And the idea of demonic possession is one that's been explored so many times in horror movies, from The Exorcist to The Evil Dead. And there's a lot of great horror movies that deal with possession. And I wouldn't say this isn't really, the topic isn't necessarily original, but the approach to the possession movie is very original. In most possession films, we get to stand outside and observe what's going on from an outsider's perspective, and it's frightening. Loose is the exact opposite, where you get to actually experience the disorienting feeling of being inside possession. So that's, I think, one of the film's unique achievements. It's the first possession movie that puts you directly, squarely inside the experience. Now, the first time you watch the movie, it's probably going to be a little bit confusing, hard to decipher, and kind of baffling. but I think that's all by design. I've seen it about 4 times now since I purchased it on Amazon Prime, and I slowly became very fascinated with this movie. The more you see it, the more the details reveal themselves to you, and you realize it's a fairly straightforward story. It's actually really not very complicated at all. It's just told in a manner that seems complicated because we're experiencing the demonic possession along with Luce. What's more impressive is that it's almost a no-budget film. It barely runs an hour long. It was made at an art school, and it was started off as a 20 to 30 minute short film, much how Michael's feature film Pay Up started off as a 20 to 30 minute idea, and slowly ballooned out after that. And it basically, the movie boils down to only 2 locations, basically a bar, an interrogation room at what is supposed to be a police station. It doesn't really leave either location, but the movie feels so vast and expansive, and you feel like you're watching time disintegrate in front of you. And the way that it's filmed, the cinematography, the way that the room is filled with smoke, the type of imagery that's interjected once you start getting into the actual possession is wholly unique, and it's kind of a miraculous little piece of filmmaking. To have a student film be this accomplished in setting out what it sets out to do, it's just such an original horror movie and such a unique vision. And the more I see it, the more mesmerized and the more hypnotized I am by each time. All the little details impress me. I love that it was shot on 16mm film, and it gives it a wonderfully grainy retro look. I love the synth score that it has that also contributes to its retro look and its retro style. And it has some pretty good actors, I'd say, for a film that's a student movie. The lead, Luce, has a really great presence. She's played by actress Luana Velez. She's really good in this movie. Like, you really get the sense that she is a dark person. She comes across as kind of cool and rebellious, but you could see that there's something very dark inside of her soul that a demon would be attracted to or would want to be bonded with. And the whole experience of her slowly being seduced by a demon is completely original within the possession subgenre. And like I said, I'm just really impressed with this no-budget filmmaking that seems a lot much larger scale than it actually is. Mesmerizing from start to finish, and it's amazing that it packs it all in just over an hour. And I have the feeling the more that I watch this in the future, the more it's going to rise on my list. And it's, like I said, it's a fairly new movie. It's a little bit obscure and it's hard to find. You can either rent it or purchase it through Amazon Prime, at least in the US. If you're looking for something unique, original, and challenging in the horror genre, I really suggest that you seek this movie out and watch it. But don't just watch it once, watch it twice so you can fully grasp and appreciate what the film is doing.
Yeah, because the story is not spoon-fed to you.
No. You remember, the only way that the film started to make sense for me is when I started to recall it in my brain. And once you start, like the way that you pick apart a dream, slowly the story comes into focus and you realize that it's not really that confusing at all. You're just made to feel like you're being confused because you're going through the demonic possession with Luce. Yeah. A very original use of, cinematic language to convey that type of feeling.
Because sometimes you don't know what's going on, but the main character don't know what's going on either.
But it's weird because the repeat viewings, it seems like such a straightforward movie now. But then when I look back on it, I was like, I could see how that would have confused me upon the first viewing, or why I was baffled so much when I'd first seen it.
And that was a weird experience how it started unfolding in my mind after I watched it. Like, I didn't know what the hell was going on, but when we started talking about it, all of a sudden I knew.
And if you let yourself go, you have to really let yourself go with this movie. You'll be tranced out too, even if you don't fully understand upon the first viewing what exactly is going on. It's hard not to be at least drawn in by the artistry on display. It is directed by Tilman Singer, a German filmmaker. I'm really looking forward to his career as a filmmaker, because if this was his film, this is a student film, a thesis film, I can only imagine what this director would accomplish with this type of vision and a bigger budget and much more resources.
The only thing about a movie like that is the director has set the bar so high for himself on his first student film. How is he going to match that when he gets a studio budget?
You're listening to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show Podcast.
So my number 24 is quite a bit sillier than your 24. It's a sequel to a classic, but that became a classic on its own, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 from 1986. Directed once again by Tobe Hooper, written by L.M. Kit Carson, It's about a radio host named Stretch that catches the attention of the cannibalistic Sawyer family when she plays audio from one of their murders on the air. The standouts are, of course, Bill Mosely, who became a legend because of this movie. He played Chop Top. Carolyn Williams played Stretch in an awesome role for her. Dennis Hopper in one of my favorite Dennis Hopper roles as Lefty. He was batshit crazy in this one. And Jim Sidow from the first one. His role expanded quite a bit in this one, and I love him in this one. He's funny as hell. He's scary as hell. I love the opening scene in this because it doesn't match the wild abandon of the rest of it. It doesn't have that comedic aspect. It's really viscerally scary. These two pricks that are driving on the road, two college kids, catch the attention. They're off goofing off and shooting signs. Leatherface and the Sawyer family come, and it's not even leather. You don't even notice it's Leatherface at first. He's got his arms and stuff in the clothes of a dead body. So you see this rotting dead body floating, like bouncing around in front of Leatherface while he's taking the chainsaw into the top of these dudes' car while they're driving down the road. He puts it down to the top of their car and just starts laying into him with the chainsaw. And it's scary, it's gory, it's visceral.
It's also one of the weirdest kill scenes I've ever seen in a horror movie. I think this is a great sequel because for one, Tobe Hooper realized he could not repeat what he did with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a very unique experience, and it was made under grueling conditions, harsh conditions, and the people who were making it were not necessarily having a good time and kind of going insane.
Yeah.
The movie captures a certain dirty, gritty realism, and it captures the insanity that was going on behind the filmmaking process. It's such a unique movie that you could never hope to get a sequel that's going to expand upon the grittiness and the realism of it. So since Tobe Hooper recognized this, he went in the exact opposite direction. So instead of repeating myself, let's take the story in the different direction and let's make this the tonal opposite of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's a little gorier than the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is, but it's possessed with a zany, wild spirit and a certain kind of abandon where you get the sense of a filmmaker just letting go and using his original concept he'd had to do something just completely fun. I get the feeling that this is a film made by somebody who was in love with the filmmaking process and having a blast, exploring his characters in a zany, completely different way from the original film.
And to me, it still feels like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I don't think it's as much a departure as a lot of people say it is. I just think you get to know the Sawyer family more in this one. You get to know them more intimately, and when you get to know them more intimately, you'd realize that they're hilarious and batshit insane.
How absurd they are as people.
Yeah, and everything kind of revolves around that, and I love how the character of Stretch is just immersed in this hell that is their little lair, and you get to see more of their lair, and the production design of it is really cool. All the different little corridors they go to. I think they built that whole thing themselves. But it's a crazy fight all the way to the end. The characters are fun to watch over and over, and I would love this. This movie would be on my list just for the chainsaw fight between Leatherface and
Dennis Hopper.
And
who could resist that? Dennis Hopper being Dennis Hopper in one of his hammiest insane roles.
Yeah, and before he even gets to Leatherface, you see him go to the chainsaw store picking out chainsaws, and you see the reaction of the store owner. It's just classic. And I don't know why Dennis Hopper hates this movie so much. He said it's one of the worst movies he was ever in.
What's cool is that this actually came out the same year as Blue Velvet and Hoosiers, which were other two big roles for Dennis Hopper. So 1986 was a really good year for that man.
He was at his crazy best in this one. The campiness of his performance is just so entertaining. And then plus Bill Mosely with Chop Top with the... taking the hanger and scratching the plate and scratching the flesh off the edge of his plate on his head, yelling like, "Get that bitch, Leatherface, get that bitch," or "Lick my plate, you dog dick." So many iconic scenes with him in it, so many great lines. And Caroline Williams is a great final girl in this one, and just the comedy and the energy of it, and while being gorier than the first one, but much more comedic and with a wild, more slapstick energy. I love everything about it, and that's why Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 is my number 24.
Good choice, Michael.
One of a few appearances of Tobe Hooper on my list.
My number 23 is another possession film called Possession from 1981, directed by Andrzej Zulawski. I'm just going to read you the premise on the letterbox because it's a very hard movie to put into words. A young woman left her family for an unspecified reason. The husband determines to find out the truth and starts following his wife. At first, he suspects that a man is involved, but gradually he finds out more and more strange behavior and bizarre incidents that indicate something more than a possessed love affair. This, along with Loose, is one of the most unique possession films ever made because this does have to do with possession, but I don't think I don't think it has anything to do with demonic entities. This is a much more literal possession, and I'd hate to ruin the surprise for people who haven't seen it because you must see this movie because it is batshit fucking insane. Like The Brood, it deals with a crumbling marriage and an impending divorce. The couple is played by the magnificent Isabelle Adjani, who gives an absolutely astonishing performance in this film. You could tell that she went to very emotionally damaging and uncomfortable places to pull this role off. And of course, the great Sam Neill, who is one of horror's greatest actors. It deals with the dissolution of the marriage. It does it in a way that seems horrifying and inexplicable, and it involves an octopus-like creature and a woman's strange relationship with that octopus-like creature. And it's hard to describe the plot other than it's about a divorced couple, because most of the effect of the movie comes in through how it actually plays out. It has one of the most inexplicably disturbing scenes I've ever seen in any movie. It's a scene where Isabelle Adjani is walking through a tunnel on her own, and she starts having this really manic freak-out, throwing her body up and around, and then you start to see she starts oozing pus in different colors, and this scene goes on a lot longer than it should go on, and that's what makes it so effective. It's so bizarre and hard to understand what you're looking at, and it becomes really gross and uncomfortable, and just when you think you've had enough, it goes even further, and Isabelle Adjani just starts letting out these really primal screams, and you see this fucking rage racked on her face as really gross pus is coming out of her, and she's flinging her body in very weird directions in a very gritty setting. I really don't know what was going on in that scene at all. Like, at all. It's not clear to me. But I do know that when I watched it, I felt shaken to my core. I felt like something terrible was going on. So I notice this with a lot of movies. I like movies that communicate feelings without ever outright stating what those feelings are. I like when a filmmaker can use the medium of film itself to try to put you in a certain mind state, and this movie does that wonderfully. It's awkward, it's uncomfortable, it's horrifying, it's completely unique within the horror genre, and just one of the most unique movies I've ever seen in general. And for that reason, Possession is my number 23 film.
Oh, I love Possession. A great, really intense performance by the Isabelle Adjani.
She actually said that she would never work with the director after that, with that director again after that, Andrzej Zulawski. She said it took her to such emotionally uncomfortable places that she's happy that she went through the experience and she's proud of the work, but she said it's not something she could never do again or would be willing to do again as an actress.
And the best possession films are kind of confusing and confounding, because if you believe in demons and you believe in demonic possession, they use manipulation and confusion to get you into a possessed
state of mind,
into a state where they can possess you.
Yes. So Possession, my number 23 film, totally unique, 1981, the UK.
My number 23 is one of your all-time favorites. I'm sure it's going to be way up farther on your list. It's Carrie from 1976.
I already knew what it was when you said it.
Directed by the great Brian De Palma. It's probably my favorite from Brian De Palma. Written by Lawrence D. Cohen, who also wrote the great Ghost Story, and he wrote the first part of the It miniseries, which is by far the best part. And he also wrote the Carrie remake, which I thought was very well written. There are some problems that I have with the remake, but the writing was not one of them. And it was based on a book by Stephen King, of course.
Stephen King's first novel.
Yeah. And almost every cast member shines in this, with Sissy Spacek being on top of all of them. And then Piper Laurie is the mom. William Catt, John Travolta, Nancy Allen, PJ Souls, all great performances to buoy Sissy Spacek's groundbreaking performance, and just unprecedented, I think, in horror. It's one of the best horror characters ever. It's cinematic, it's moody, it's compelling, it's sad, it's shocking, especially for at the time. The prom scene is bona fide classic scene. It's another one that's burned into the minds of all horror fans.
It's one of the most brilliantly directed scenes in the history of movies. Not horror movies, the history of movies, period. As far as I'm concerned.
And the mom, played by Piper Laurie, with They're All Gonna Laugh at You. And some of the scenes between Sissy Spacek and Piper Laurie are riveting. They're heartbreaking.
She's so batshit and hammy that her performance almost ventures into camp.
Yeah.
Yet it somehow remains grounded in a certain kind of reality, and she still remains frightening, where you laugh at her, you get a kick out of how fucking insane she is and the weird things that fly out of her mouth, but she's a pretty horrifying creation at the same time.
Yeah, and she's a big testament of how Carrie is, and how she carries herself, and how mousy she is, and how she allows herself to get picked on so much at school, and how she can't stand up for herself.
That Sissy Spacek and Piper Laurie's great in this movie. Most of the performances in here are top notch, but as great as Piper Laurie is, and it is one of the greatest horror villains, I think Sissy Spacek delivers one of the best performances in the history of the horror genre. Every time I watch it, my heart just breaks for her at every moment. I feel her pain, I feel what she's going through, and she's hard not to feel something towards.
And she ultimately becomes the villain, but she still doesn't feel like a villain, because it's kind of understandable
how she arrived at what she arrived at.
Yeah, exactly.
It's John Travolta's first film. He was already in Welcome Back, Kotter, but it was his first theatrical motion picture.
Carrie, one of my favorite Stephen King films, one of my favorite horror films, and one of my favorite performances by any actress is Sissy Spacek in Carrie, and that's why it's my number 23.
Magnificent choice, Michael. My number 22 is John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982. And it's really simple why this is on my list. It's amongst the most visceral horror movies I've ever seen in my life. I don't think there's a whole lot of subtext going on in here. There is a little bit of an exploration of mistrust and the dynamic that produces, but what makes this such a good horror movie is the way that it's directed and the fantastic gore and makeup effects. This is the most inventive makeup in the history of horror films in terms of what they've managed to visualize on screen. The imagery is absolutely horrifying, and it starts off as a film that seems like it's going to be a slow burn for the first part of it, and once it starts to hit its stride, when it goes absolutely insane, it doesn't slow down, and it builds tension upon tension upon tension, and it does this by giving you some of the fucking twackiest images you've ever seen in a horror movie, whether you're seeing somebody's body being body being ripped apart by the thing, being shaken around like a rag doll. Yeah. It's visceral and it's heart racing. There's a couple of really effective jump scares that work because you don't anticipate them coming. I'm thinking of the scene when Kurt Russell as Macready is trying to test who might be the thing, who might actually be the alien that they're trying to kill, and he's testing each of them and testing their blood samples to see if the blood reacts, because the thing is a creature that takes the form of anything that it touches. It could replicate any human being and hide in plain sight as somebody else. And the scene where Kurt Russell is going through and testing the blood, when he applies the hot needle to the blood and the blood pops up for one particular character, it's genuinely jarring. And I like to show this movie to people so I could see their reactions when that scene comes. It never fails. Everybody I know always jumps back in their seat. It's such a wild movie, and it seems like John Carpenter threw a lot of abandon into the movie. And that's one of the good things about it. It's very masterfully controlled, beautifully composed as a piece of filmmaking, and it hits every beat perfectly, but it's composed in sanity. Yeah. It doesn't feel like it's a slow burn or measured, even though everything in the movie is very measured. It doesn't feel like a slow burn film. And it's exciting, it's visceral, it's gory, it's gooey, it's really imaginative. Once it gets going, it never lets up. It has the best gore makeup effects in history, and it has a great score from Ennio Morricone, who was my favorite composer, who did the music for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and more recently The Hateful Eight from Quentin Tarantino, which in itself is actually something of an homage to The Thing, even though it's not a horror film. Yeah. And what's cool about that is John Carpenter is known, well, he's known for a lot of things, but one of the things he's known for is for his wonderful scores. He's definitely one of the best filmmakers to compose his own films. You would think that he would have composed the music for this, considering this is one of his greatest achievements, but he had the opportunity to work with the legend and stepped back to let him take over the score, and it is one of Morricone's best scores. It's more subtle than his work on The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, or even The Hateful Eight, but it manages to convey a sense of unending tension, a sense of impending doom from the minute it opens. Just that dun-dun, that simple thud, that simple little bass thud that's repeated throughout the entire film helps to jack up the tension a lot in it. And of course, I love the wintry setting. You don't see too many horror movies set in the snow. Of course, you have the great Kurt Russell leading this film. Keith David is one of my favorite characters in the movie. All around solid performers. It's one of the few times that Carpenter had a really big budget, and you could see the money on screen.
Yeah.
You could see the money that they threw at this movie. Almost the opposite of Halloween, where in Halloween, he used the bare minimum to produce something really creepy. With The Thing, he used everything at his disposal to just shock you and rattle you from moment to moment to moment. It's just a masterful piece of filmmaking and one of John Carpenter's greatest achievements.
It still looks like the budget's bigger than what it is.
Mm-hmm. And you had it on your list on the last episode, I believe.
Yeah.
I'm surprised it's not higher, Michael. One of the greats. So for those reasons, The Thing is on my list at number 22.
My number 22 is Pet Sematary from 1989, the ultimate Stephen King movie for me. It's directed by Mary Lambert, who went on to direct Part 2, which I absolutely love as well. It's another one like Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, where the same director did Part 2 and she went completely insane with it. It was written by Stephen King based on his own book. The standouts in this was perfect casting as far as I'm concerned. Dale Midkiff as Lewis Creed, perfect Lewis Creed. Fred Gwynn as Judd Crandall. You can't get any better than Fred Gwynn for Judd Crandall. Denise Crosby was a great Rachel Creed. You really felt her emotion in this. And especially Miko Hughes as Gage was an awesome little actor. It has so many iconic images. Another one where these images are stuck in horror fans' heads for life. Church the Cat, the little gray cat. That's why I didn't like the
remake.
Church the Cat in the remake. There's many reasons why I didn't like the remake. But one of them is making Church a tabby cat. Come on. So it's Church the Cat. Judd Crandall saying, "Don't go down that road." That was an awesome little speech he gives. Gage being hit by the truck was an awesome scene. Very well filmed. You felt the emotion of the parents. You felt the impact of the truck. The Pet Sematary itself, the look of it and the feel of it. And Zelda. Holy shit, Zelda. Scary ass character without being a monster like she was in the remake. The drama is heart-wrenching. The sadness in it is heart-wrenching, and I especially feel it as a parent. And it still ended up being fun. The scares were both visceral and fun, and they were all very well crafted. And I absolutely love it. It's pitch perfect for me. Mary Lambert did an awesome job here, and it's a classic that holds up over many repeat viewings, and that's why it's my number 22, Pet Sematary.
My number 21 is Repulsion from 1965, directed by the great but problematic Roman Polanski. I'm going to make a bold statement. For me, this is the greatest descent into madness ever put on film. The story is very simple. An immigrant and her sister move to Britain. One sister is an extrovert who is having an affair with a married man. The other sister is a shy, awkward young woman who seems seized with the repulsion of men in particular and the idea of sex in general. As she's left alone in her apartment, her mind begins to feed on itself, and her overall fear of sex becomes crippling and drives her to insanity that ends in multiple murder. It's a masterpiece of low-budget filmmaking that features an astonishingly good performance from legendary French actress Catherine Deneuve in the main role. Now, I feel this is definitely one of the most underrated horror movies in the genre. There's some movies that get that are about a psychological descent into madness that are a little bit more accurate as far as psychology goes, but few have mastered the madness aspect of this very well. And it's another one of those horror films that I noticed that I like. It doesn't have an external villain. The villain is the mind itself and your own inner demons, your own fear is where all of the horror derives from, because most of the horrific scenes in this movie are projections of one person's subconscious fears. They don't have to do with any force coming after her, and ultimately the main character, played by Catherine Deneuve, she is her own worst enemy by the end of the movie. It's an interesting horror movie because it very lightly suggests that the main character went through sexual abuse as a young child, and the only thing that hints at it is one photograph that the camera lingers on a couple of times, so you know it's meant to draw attention to itself. You see her as a young girl with her family, and all of her family seems like a bunch of normal people, and she's standing off in the distance from the rest of her family, and she has a very forlorn look on her face as she kind of stares off into the distance. So you get the feeling that she was going through some kind of abuse or trauma from a very young age, though the movie never outright says it. I think that's what contributes to its power. It's the way that it's so suggestive. Roman Polanski's film does wonderful use of sticking to mainly one location. And there's not just one location in the movie. It goes outside to the streets of London, and you get to see different exteriors of the UK. But most of it takes place in one apartment, much like Rosemary's Baby. And you get to see the mental projections, the fears that Catherine Deneuve's characters have come to life. She imagines that somebody's breaking into her house at night and raping her. I think it handles it very well, though I think the fact that it's from Roman Polanski is going to put a lot of people off because of the subject matter. But I like the way that it's filmed. I like the style. And it has one of the coolest images in horror is Catherine Deneuve, and it's shot in black and white. As she's walking down a hallway, the camera exaggerates how long the hallway looks, and then you see men's arms just break out of the wall, and she tries to walk her way all the way to her room, and she's having a bunch of hands grab at her and grope her, and you could see how it drives her insane. One of her male suitors eventually becomes one of her victims because he becomes a little bit too pushy and trying to push himself on her. She's a very beautiful young woman, and it's hard to see why she's so disturbed until you look at that photograph, and it starts to suggest something very sinister in her past. I like the way that it's filmed. I like the style. I like the editing of it, the use of black and white cinematography, and because I just love films that take one location and make the story seem a lot more expansive than they actually are. Because throughout the movie, even though you're stuck through this one apartment, you're not necessarily exploring the apartment. You're exploring the deepest reaches of her brain, her subconscious brain, and the fears that she has about sex and her repulsion against men. There's a very unique little horror film, one that features a great performance, and for me, just the greatest descent into madness ever put on film. And for that reason, Repulsion is number 21 from 1965, Roman Polanski.
Once again, my 21 is quite a bit sillier than your 21. It's The Return of the Living Dead, 1985. Oh, that's a great movie, though. Written and directed by Dan O'Bannon, who wrote Alien, Dead and Buried, Life Force, and Invaders from Mars. But he also directed this one. The standouts are Clu Gallagher as Bert, James Karen as Frank, Don Calfa as Ernie, and Linnea Quigley as Trash in one of her greatest roles. Just plain and simple, it's a perfect horror comedy. It's so sincere that it makes it that much more hilarious because you're watching slapstick comedy on screen in, very dark slapstick comedy, but still comedy nonetheless. But the characters are so sincere about it, and they're so serious about what their plight is. Mm-hmm. You have the awesome zombie, one of the greatest and most iconic zombies, the one that came out of that vat, and he's screaming, yelling brains. Mm-hmm. Even though he doesn't have any lips, he shouldn't be able to say brains, but he does.
Isn't this where that concept of zombies going brains and eating brains, it originates from The Return of the Living Dead, right?
Yeah, and this was the first fast zombies. So this is where the running zombies first made their appearance before 28 Days Later. And I love the dynamic between Clu Gallagher, James Karen, and Don Calfa when they're trying to figure out how to remedy this. And they try to cremate the bodies, and they try to cut them up, and then the body parts come alive. And it's just slapstick horror comedy at its best. And that's why it's my number 21, Return of the Living Dead, 1985. One of the funnest horror films ever made.
It's kind of the inverse of... Wait, you like this more than Night of the Living Dead? It just corrected me. I have to disagree with that one there. But it's it feels like it's the inverse to a George Romero zombie film, because where those movies are very serious and they traffic in a lot of social commentary and a lot of messages, this takes the same concept but uses it in a more fun manner. So if you want to see a zombie film that's just about the zombies themselves with no subtext attached, it's perfect. And I think the filmmakers had a blast in carrying this movie out. It has a very fun and infectious spirit to it. And wasn't it designed as something of a sequel to Night of the Living Dead? Yeah. See, I understand that one of the screenwriters worked on Night of the Living Dead, and George Romero had the rights to the writer of the Night of the Living Dead had the rights to Of the Living Dead, that title. So he made his his own sequel. So what basically is Dawn of the Dead and Return of the Living Dead are both sequels to Night of the Living Dead. They just go in completely different directions. One continues the social commentary tone that George Romero established with Night of the Living Dead. The other one decides to just explore the zombies themselves and make it a little bit more fun. So it's interesting to have two alternate universes that you can explore from the Night of the Living Dead. You can either go Romero's route, or you can see an alternate scenario where this is the future of zombies.
Yeah. I guess in this situation, the fun and the slapstick nature of it kind of won over the more serious nature of the original Night of the Living Dead, and just the characters, the individual characters that stood out so much to me, especially James Karen and Clu Gallagher. Yeah. So that's why this is number 21 for me.
My number 20 is the second appearance from David Cronenberg on my list, The Fly from 1986. Be afraid. Be very afraid. That was the tagline, and it was a line delivered by Gina Davis. And to be honest, it's kind of corny when I watch it in the movie, but I love it anyway. So the reason this is on my list is it's one of the grossest movies ever made, but it uses its gross out and icky factor in the service of something very real and very human. The movie, at its core, is about physical deterioration, disease, physical decline, and what it's like to see another one suffer from an unavailable disease, whether it's cancer or AIDS or anything that eats away at the body. And of course, David Cronenberg seems to be fascinated with the fragility of the flesh and the body's the very nature of the body, how it's not this indestructible machine, how it could be racked by illness or disease. And at the time, it was interpreted as a metaphor for AIDS. And while David Cronenberg didn't mean it to be a film about AIDS, it came right at the height of the AIDS scare, so it ended up being the perfect film for that fear. But really, it's about any sort of disease that is eating away at somebody. The gross out makeup effects are really great in here. We have Jeff Goldblum playing the kind of like a mad scientist type Brundlefly. Seth Brundle, and you got the great Gina Davis as his love interest in this movie. And the makeup effects do a good job of kind of making you want to gag. I think The Thing is more inventive in terms of what it does with its makeup, but The Thing, whereas the makeup effects, the shocking makeup effects for that are meant to like pulverize you and shock you into a certain state of mind, this is meant to disgust you and make you feel repulsed. Don't watch this while you're eating. You'll probably end up regretting it. I love Jeff Goldblum's performance because he does a good job of being very engaging as a person. It reminds me a little bit of his performance later in Jurassic Park, where he's a little awkward, but there's something that you're very drawn to him about, his quirky personality. You could see how Gina Davis would have fallen from him, but he also does a great job of demonstrating the physical ailments that would come when your body, if your DNA would become fused with the fly, and you see him deteriorate and turn into a fly, the way that he moves, his insect-like movements, his behavior, and of course, he does a great job with the makeup effects in it. Because it would be one thing just to put an actor inside a fly makeup and to make them look gross, but you need an actor who can actually act the physicality out, and Jeff Goldblum delivers that in spades. It's a very sad movie. It's really tragic in the end, and the way that it deals with illness and the way it is to watch somebody you love suffer and die is pretty original. And I love that it uses the horror genre to explore a very human thing that a lot of people don't have to go through. One of the more painful experiences of life, losing a loved one. It gets to me every time I see it. It's scary. It grosses me out. It's kind of fun, and it always leaves me heartbroken by the end. And for that reason, The Fly from 1986 is number 20.
My number 20 is actually my personal favorite slasher of all time. Now, there's some other slashers higher up on my list, but this is one that, as far as a slasher subgenre goes, it has everything that I want in a slasher and everything that I love. It's Happy Birthday to Me from 1981. It's directed by J. Lee Thompson. He directed the original Cape Fear and also Guns of Navarone.
Wait, the original Cape Fear?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah, same guy as Happy Birthday to Me. It was written by a bunch of TV writers. I looked through them, and none of them are even worth mentioning. I hate, no offense to them. They didn't do anything as quite as big as Happy Birthday to Me, just a bunch of TV. The main thing I love about this is the inventive assortment of kills from an unseen killer. Melissa Sue Anderson, I love seeing her because back in the day, back in the 70s, I was a big fan of Little House on the Prairie, and she was an older sister on Little House on the Prairie. And in this one, she's an unexpected killer, and an excellent one at that, and sells the twist. And she's the main part why, and the main reason why the twist at the end is so effective. And every kill in the film is relived at the end, and it's one of my favorite endings where all the victims are sitting around a table with birthday hats on it. You see all these great kills by an unseen killer, and then when all the victims are sitting around the table at the end, you kind of relive it along with the shock of the twist and along with the performance of Melissa Sue Anderson. So for me, this is just a perfect slasher film. Not a whole lot to say about it because it's just pure slasher for me. There's not a whole lot going on for it besides that, but it's just a perfect slasher, and that's why it's number 20. Happy Birthday to Me.
I had a lot of fun when I watched that earlier this year. It is just a typical slasher, but I think it sets itself apart by having a mystery that's a little bit more original in the way that it plays out than most slasher films are. I'll never forget the one kill scene that takes place in the weight room. That's one of the oddest slasher movie kills I've ever seen.
Shut up.
My number 19 is Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho from 1960. My favorite Alfred Hitchcock film and the granddaddy of slasher movies. And what's good about this movie is that you can put this movie on now and you could show Psycho to people who don't like older movies, because there's a lot of people out there who won't watch films that came out before the 90s or the 80s or even before the 70s. This is a good gateway drug into older movies because it's immediately enveloping. It feels modern enough that a lot of audiences can connect to it. And a lot of people know the iconic shower scene. It's kind of hard not to know what it is because it's so ingrained in pop culture and it's been parodied so many times. And amongst things that have been overly parodied, that might take the cake as the most parodied film scene in history. But when you see it in context, it still works to this day. While there's very little gore in the shower kill scene, its power comes in from the way that it's edited. You see you see a knife that's about to stab in, and then you see the facial reactions. You see it cuts away to the knife being pulled back, and then you see the horror on Janet Leigh's face over and over. And it must have been really shocking at the time to see a movie like this because it eschews a traditional narrative structure of what you'd expect from a movie, and it makes Janet Leigh the star, where for about the first 40 minutes or so, the movie never leaves her. There's hardly any frame that does not feature Janet Leigh, and she's advertised as the star. What makes the movie disorienting is at a certain point, which is just a little over half hour, she gets murdered, and the movie still has over an hour left to go, and it puts you into a more disorienting state of mind because by the time it arrives there, you had already invested yourself so much into this one character. You're like, oh shit, what do we do? Where do we go now? And what happens after that makes the movie even better. And we got Anthony Perkins playing Norman Bates, one of the greatest psychos in film history.
Yeah.
Such a great performances. Anthony Perkins does a great job of making himself seem very innocent and very childlike and very naive, and you could tell he is very childlike but very creepy at the same time. From the onset, you get the sense of somebody who might be harmless but is harboring something dark behind his very boyish exterior and the way that he comports and carries himself. He's a bit of a mama's boy.
Yeah.
The ultimate mama's
boy.
boy.
Definition of mama's boy.
Yeah, it's one of the greatest performances in the history of horror films, and I love the scene where Janet Leigh and Anthony Perkins are both in his study together, and they're having a conversation over sandwiches and milk.
Yeah.
They're having a conversation about his mother, about how you shouldn't be alone, and it goes to pretty weird places very fast and does a good job of creeping you out just by the way that his eyes look. You slowly see the innocence start to melt away, and you get the sense of the demons that he's hiding behind that very innocent exterior. A couple of really good kill scenes in the movie. It's not really much of a slasher movie, but you could feel the DNA of the slasher coming out right here. You could tell that people took certain aspects of the film and later emphasized those aspects a lot and expounded upon them in further movies. The most obvious example being Halloween. Halloween is very much a tribute to Psycho, and you get the sense that it's a tribute to Psycho, especially with a Dr. Sam Loomis character in there, and the way that the kill scenes play out, and yet it's nothing like it at the same time.
Yeah.
It's inspired so much, it's easy to rewatch over and over, and even if you know the twist, it always works no matter how many times you've seen it. Anthony Perkins is great in this. Janet Leigh gives one of her best performances. The storyline is very unexpected, and it twists and turns in a very unusual ways, and I can only imagine what it must have been like to have been alive at the time. If there's one screening I would love to go back to, I would love to go back in time to 1960 to watch Psycho with an audience, to see people reacting to Janet Leigh getting slaughtered in the shower. I have no doubt people were screaming, running for the exits. Would have been a fun time to be alive to see this movie when it was fresh. And it holds up to this day. I really honestly believe that you could show this to anybody and they'll be entertained by it. If you want to try to get somebody into old movies but you're not sure which one to start with, this is the perfect gateway for that. And for that reason, Psycho is number 19. One of the greatest horror movies of all time, one of the greatest movies of all time, a masterpiece, classic, indelible. Its influence is huge. I don't think any list of great horror films is complete without Psycho on it.
And one of the greatest sets in horror history with the Psycho
Bates
House.
Motel?
With the Psycho House up on the hill with the Bates Motel down bottom.
Oh, yeah, great.
Very iconic. It was very well used in the series, too. The series was really good.
And what's interesting about this movie is that prior to this, a lot of Alfred Hitchcock's movies were much larger scale productions, and he had his TV show Alfred Hitchcock Presents. So he basically didn't use his usual cinematographer, his usual editors. He used all the people who worked on his television show and work on a much lower budget to get the look of this movie. It doesn't have the polish of something like Vertigo or Rear Window and the colorful glossy feel. It's Hitchcock bringing the story down to a more human level and doing it more raw. It has a more defiant and independent feel to it. And part of it is, I imagine, that given the time in 1960 and the types of films that were being released, I'm not sure if big studios would wanted to invest in a story so dark on a large budget. So he reduced it to its very bare elements, and it's all the set and crew are the people who worked on Alfred Hitchcock's Presents. He had a separate crew and cinematographers for his feature-length films, his theatrical movies, and his television series. And using the television crew contributes to making this film unique in Alfred Hitchcock's filmography because it doesn't possess the gloss of his earlier or his later films.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll skin your cat and it.
Well, my number 19 is one of the scariest fucking films I've ever seen, and still to this day it scares the shit out of me. Session 9 from 2001.
Oh, that movie is fucking gives me goosebumps.
Yeah, directed by Brad Anderson, co-written with by Brad Anderson and Stephen Gevedon, who also plays Mike in the movie. So between Stephen Gevedon, David Caruso, I love his performance in this. I just love that actor. Peter Mullen as Gordo, awesome performance. Brendan Sexton III as Jeff, and Josh Lucas as the douchebag Hank. It's deeply scary from beginning to end, even when there isn't inherent scary images or scary things going on screen. Just the atmosphere and the dread that it builds in the background while you're watching this drama unfold. It scares you with the visuals and the score and the emotions and the drama between these characters. It gets inside your head just the way it does the characters. It's about it's a group of men who go in to get rid of the asbestos in this. It's a Danvers State Hospital. It's a huge facility. This guy wants to open it up again, but it's filled with asbestos, so he hires this crew to clean it out. There's drama already in the way they get the job.
You could tell that all the characters have history with each other, and it's not necessarily good history. It's based on animosity and broken friendships and betrayal. And it becomes very clear when they're inside the building itself that whatever presence is lurking there is using the animosity towards that they have towards each other to its benefit.
Yeah, and it's another very good, very accomplished male ensemble cast, just like Dog Soldiers and The Thing that I mentioned earlier in my list. But I think this is even more cerebral than those films. And it's set in a real haunted place, Danvers State Hospital, which in Massachusetts, which is a whole...
An abandoned hospital, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a whole other entity in this movie, the location. You feel the presence of the location, and you feel the ghosts that are in this damn thing throughout this whole movie. And I hear that one of the actors, I believe it was Peter Mullen, who played Gordo, he was on the roof, in the roof scene, and while the rest of the actors were talking, he got, I believe it was his own voice was in his head telling him to jump off the edge. And he said it felt so inside of him that he didn't even realize that he was just about to listen to it.
You know, that's probably one of the greatest locations in horror film history, because when I first saw this movie, and this is a fairly new watch for me, I thought that was a set, and I was like, wow, how did they get a set that looks that authentic? I didn't feel like I was watching a horror movie set. It felt like a real place. And then when you told me that that was actually an abandoned mental institute, I was like, that explains a lot. It helps to give the movie a certain type of realistic atmosphere that you would not be able to create if you were intentionally designing a set to be spooky or trying to make it look eerie.
Yeah.
It just is. There's a very earthy quality to that location. One of the greatest locations in horror film history.
And one of the characters, Mike, played by the writer Stephen Gevedon, he keeps going off by himself and listening to these session tapes, which it's like psychiatrist session with a woman who has multiple personalities. Every time this guy hits play on these sessions, the goosebumps get bigger on my arms and all over my body. It's just creepy as hell. And then when you approach session 9, you know that something scarier is coming. And then when the session 9 gets there, it's even scarier than you expected it to be.
I'm actually getting chills recalling it. I like the way that these tapes are revealed, because it's revealed very slowly. It's not all at once throughout the film. You see the character hitting play and listening to a piece of it. And every time you hear these session tapes with this girl and her multiple personalities talking to the therapist, it starts to get really creepy and it gets under your skin. And when I felt it, I felt literal goosebumps on my arms.
Yeah.
I felt the hair standing up. And each time they hit the session tapes, it gets eerier and eerier and eerier. And my God, the fucking voices that are on there just fucking scare the shit out of me. This is one of those rare horror movies that really, really creeps me out with its totally unique atmosphere that doesn't even always feel like you're watching a movie anymore.
Yeah. And there's a voice that's in the head of Gordo from the beginning of the movie, and it's kind of a strange voice that you don't hear anywhere else. And then when that voice comes up on those tapes after you've just been hearing it in Gordo's head through the rest of the movie, just the chills that raise up on you. It's so effective. Every reveal of the story, because you're watching the story unfold and the drama unfold between these characters, and you're also hearing the past story of the
mental institute and
the mental institute unfold. And it's all fascinating, and it's constant tension, and the tension is so thick in it that you think that the ending is not going to be satisfying, because
it is satisfying though.
Yeah, you think that there's no way the ending could match this tension that it's building, and I'll be damned if it does. Every story reveal you don't see coming, and it's very effective when it does. And I know it's silly, but I love the classic "fuck you" from David Caruso in this movie, where he's arguing with Gordo, and the camera kind of zooms in on him just as he says "fuck you," and it's right in the middle of this very dramatic scene. But just one of the many things I absolutely love about Session 9, one of my favorite haunted house movies, haunted
movies.
Haunted hospital movies, haunted asylum.
Whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Haunted location. That's
Yeah.
probably a better word.
Yeah, and probably the most atypical of those types of movies, because when you think abandoned mental asylum movie, you don't think a movie like Session 9 that's going to worm its way inside your head. You think of something more fun, which it ends up being fun, but in a very scary way. Like, I love being scared, and this movie scares the shit out of me, and that's why it's number 19, Session 9. Go see it, everyone, if you haven't, because it's criminally underseen and not talked about enough.
It's probably, if I were to make a list of the 10 most underrated horror movies of all time, Session 9 would definitely have pride of place on that list.
Cool.
My number 18 film this already appeared on your list during our last podcast, is Hereditary from last year, Ari Aster. Why this is number 18? I knew the instant that I saw this movie, as it was unfolding, I felt like I was watching a new horror classic unfold right before my very eyes. When I watched it, I was like, this is going to go down in history with The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby. Now, I know not everybody's going to agree with me on that one, but I don't give a fuck. I really think it really measures up to all of those movies. There's something giddy or exciting about watching a film unfold, especially we saw it on opening day, knowing that this is going to be a future classic and one of the pinnacles of the horror genre.
Yeah.
It's one of the most magnificently acted horror films of all time. Toni Collette, my God, what a fucking powerhouse performance that she delivers. She has to go through rage, anger, the most gut-wrenching despair that you could ever imagine. It deals with trauma, with loss, and I'm not even speaking about the horror of the movie. There's very compelling and deeply uncomfortable human drama and dynamics that go on with the movie. They deal with how Toni Collette as a mother deals with her husband, played by Gabriel Byrne, and her son, played by Alex Wolff, which is another great performance that's almost as good as Toni Collette's. You could tell that they both threw a lot of themselves physically and emotionally into these roles. And if you removed the horror from this movie, it would still be deeply uncomfortable and it would get under your skin just because of the drama that the movie centers around. When you throw the horror elements in, when you throw the satanic aspects into the movie, the more demonic aspects, it only helps to make the film that much more effective. So it gets under your skin from the beginning and then fucking smacks you upside the head with absolutely unbelievably accomplished atmosphere. There's no parts of this movie that have jump scares, but there's a couple of scenes that work the way that jump scares work, even though they're not designed that way. The scene I'm thinking of in particular is when Toni Collette is on the ceiling of her house. Yeah. And you see her in the corner and you just realize it's very quiet and it doesn't do anything to announce it. And you're just looking at the frame and then you realize that she's up against the ceiling looking down at her son in a very predatory way.
Yeah.
It kind of like startles you. So much startling imagery in this movie. You feel that you're watching something very evil unfold. Like The Shining or Rosemary's Baby or The Exorcist, it is seeped in a certain type of atmosphere that radiates inhuman evil. There's not a false note in this movie. I even like the ending that most people hate. I think in the future it's going to be considered a great ending. When you think about the ending of Rosemary's Baby or something like that, it goes right up there on the list for me. And we've talked so much about this, so I'm not going to blabber on, but it's just impressively active, extremely scary, gives you the goosebumps, has scenes that work like jump scares even though they actually aren't. It's deeply uncomfortable. The acting is astonishing, and it's just a wonderful debut film. Ari Aster arrived on the scene fully formed. This is not a half-baked vision or the work of a fledgling director trying to find his voice and figure out what it is that he does or what he specializes in. Ari Aster came onto the scene fully formed as an artist and delivered a masterpiece right out the gate. And for that reason, Hereditary from last year is number 18 on my list. I'm convinced this is going to go down in history as one of the greatest horror films of all time. And in the future, I wouldn't be surprised if it rose higher on my list.
Cool, I think so too. It's one of the best.
Yes.
My number 18 is Event Horizon from 1997.
Awesome movie.
My personal favorite sci-fi horror film, and this movie is way better than it should be. It's directed by Paul W.S. Anderson, who directed Mortal Kombat and Resident Evil, which aren't good movies to me. And written by Philip Eisner, who only wrote Mutant Chronicles, is the only other notable thing he wrote. But holy shit, is it good. Especially with Sam Neill and Lawrence Fishburne.
Another Sam Neill film on our list.
Yeah. Great performance by Sam Neill. Lawrence Fishburne is awesome in this. Kathleen Quinlan is great. Jolie Richardson. And Sean Pertwee, who was in Dog Soldiers. It's an excellent and ambitious sci-fi movie. And even if you took the horror element out, it would still be a good, entertaining, fun sci-fi film. It's scary as hell. And it's a horror film that feels evil when evil is present. Every time evil is present on the screen, you feel it. I don't know how this director achieved this out of the rest of his movies, but holy damn.
Because it's a unique science fiction horror film, because most sci-fi horror is more like The Thing or Ridley Scott's Alien, where it's a horror film, but the horror comes from the science fiction elements, whether it's something unknown that we're dealing with. This is an unusual science fiction horror movie because it takes place in space. It's a science fiction setting, but the actual enemy is not something that's science-based. It's supernatural evil. It's actually has to deal with black holes and penetrating to other dimensions. And I love the idea of this movie that they opened up a black hole, Sam Neill's character, and they opened up basically what I interpret as a portal to hell. So anything that comes out of that black hole into this universe stinks and reeks of evil and madness. Very Lovecraftian too. So the imagery is some of the most unique imagery ever put in a horror movie. And God, it's a gorgeous movie to look at too. Shot by shot, it has just beautiful to look at. Even if you remove the horror, just the sets itself are impressive to look at.
And it's just scary, the fact that they go so far out into deep space where no one has ever explored. And of course, if you go out in that deep of space, of course there might be some evil entity hanging around out there.
You know what? I find it strangely plausible, because the idea is that there's different dimensions to the world that we know, and we know that black holes lead somewhere else. If you opened up dimensions, it only makes sense that you would open up to a dimension where things are, if they're not evil in the way that we are, their world functions differently than ours would, in a way that's dark, in a way that we would interpret as evil, or a way that we would experience. So I find it a little plausible, strangely.
Yeah. And out of all the many scary scenes in it, the scariest scene is largely unseen when the crew of this new ship boards the Event Horizon, and they go to their surveillance tapes, and they go to try to see what happened to this crew.
Oh man,
and
I love that scene.
The crew, there's like a blood orgy where they're just having sex and killing each other, and there's blood everywhere, and you get little glimpses of it. And apparently there was 30 minutes more that was filmed of this, and it's been since lost. The producer and the director searched the world for this thing. It was lost. That I guess the prints were mismanaged, but it's still one of the scariest parts, even though it's largely unseen. And what impresses me most about this is the amazing visuals that are both of the ship design and of the design of the gore. The makeup and the effects are very scary, but all the scariest scenes are unseen. You don't see what is scary. So your
the fear of the unknown.
Yeah, and your imagination is conjuring up what's unseen, and makes it even scarier than what you're seeing on screen.
That's a really interesting point to make, because most movies that rely on the viewer's imagination to conjure up the horror don't have as much horrific imagery on this as this. They give you horrific imagery and then tease it even further what you don't see, thinking, if that freaks me out and if this is that weird, I can only imagine what they're not showing us, almost like it makes it seem a little more dangerous. It's very effective in that way. Not many hidden horror movies that are supposed to be psychological have this much jarring and strange imagery in them.
And when you see all these body parts laying around and people just ripped to shreds, and you see all the gore, and you feel like you experience what happened to them even though you don't. But it's another excellent representation of how evil manipulates. And again, it's way better than it should be. And that's why number 18 is Event Horizon from 1997.
This is a great movie. My number 17 movie is Candyman from 1992, directed by Bernard Rose. and starring the great Tony Todd as Candyman himself and Virginia Madsen. Based on the short story The Clive Barker The Forbidden that appears in his short story collection In the Flesh, which is a part of the Books of Blood series, it is one of the most magnificent gothic horror movies ever made. And what I love about it is that it feels modern enough in terms of when it was made. There's a lot of good gore in here and a lot of bloody scenes, but it has the fabled mythology of and the respectability of the classic Universal horror monsters. I'm thinking in particular of Bela Lugosi as Dracula. I feel that Tony Todd possesses the same air of aristocracy, the same kind of mesmerizing effect, because he's not a particular, like when you see him, he looks more cool than he does scary, and his voice is very hypnotizing. You could see how every character would fall under the spell of Candyman, and the fact that he's hidden for so much of the movie is even more effective, because Tony Todd's presence looms over the entire picture, and whenever he shows up you get chills, but you're also mesmerized by him. There's something about the way that he speaks, his slow manner of speaking. And of course, as I mentioned on the last podcast, Tony Todd is a classically trained stage actor, and I think it really comes across in this role. You could definitely see how he's probably one of, for lack of a better word, one of the sexier horror villains. Somebody that it seduces you as opposed to attacking you, and it very slowly insinuates itself into your brain. So it's a great performance that isn't even in a whole lot of the movie, but manages to loom over every scene. It has a unique atmosphere about it. It has interesting social commentary about people meddling in other cultures that they don't understand, thinking that they can arrive at something. And I love how they explore the idea of the real life horrors that you have to deal with in many urban neighborhoods. And of course it takes place largely at Cabrini Green, which is one of the worst, which at the time of this movie came out was the worst project in the United States, although they've renovated now and it's not really the same. How it uses that location and the natural real world horrors to blend in with Candyman, so you can kind of see how for a while you're watching the movie, maybe there isn't really the supernatural presence that's there. Maybe it's just the way that people project the horrors that they deal with in their everyday lives onto a fantasy figure, and then once you realize that it is actually a real thing, this is not in their imagination, that makes it all the much creepier. Really original horror movie, and of course, being based in Clive Barker's writing, it was bound to be an excellent movie. We talked about this so much on the podcast before. I absolutely love Candyman from 1992, Bernard Rose, and it has to be said, Philip Glass gives one of my favorite scores in any horror movie I've ever seen. That really hypnotic, gothic sounding score contributes so much to the atmosphere of the movie and the feeling that it gives off. And of course, Virginia Madsen, who gets a little bit overshined by Tony Todd because he's the villain of the movie, actually delivers a really good performance, and you get to feel her pain. She's a little bit enraging and annoying at first because you could tell she's meddling things that she doesn't understand and tries to pretend she has a grasp on a certain type of urban culture that she doesn't really have on. But I feel she ultimately redeems herself by the end, and you end up rooting for her. And the fact that all the social commentary and how it deals with real world horrors, and it weaves a personal journey into the film for Virginia Madsen. You get to see her marriage, how it's not working out, what a bad husband she is, and how through these horrifying, she doesn't really stick up for herself in her marriage, and she lets her husband get away with a lot more than he should. And through her traumatic journey of encountering the Candyman, she becomes a better, stronger individual by the end of the movie. And so many reasons, but this is my number 17 film, Candyman. Love it. Classic. I've seen it dozens of times, and it's a movie I'm going to grow old with.
Cool. Great choice. My number 17, this is going to be short and sweet because we've been talking about it a lot lately. The Devil's Rejects from 2005.
Really? That's your number 17?
Yeah.
All right.
We talked about it when 3 from Hell came out. We talked about it when Sid died. And it's written and directed by Rob Zombie, of course, Sid Haig, Bill Mosely, Sherry Moon Zombie, William Forsythe, Leslie Easterbrook. So Rob Zombie created new horror icons. And I'll just simply say I gave a whole list of why it's a perfect movie, but this is a perfect and brutal horror film. I love it. It's every scene is memorable to me and sticks in my head, and 17 is The Devil's Rejects, Rob Zombie.
So perfect. I'm going to piggyback on that. My number 16 is The Devil's Rejects from Rob Zombie. So we've, like we said, we talked about this a lot, but we're giving the countdown, so I'm going to list a few more reasons again. It has the insanity of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre while injecting a type of macabre sense of humor that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre doesn't have. I think Part 2 has it, but but you see a little bit of Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 in here as well.
But it's not slapstick.
But it's not slapstick. Zombie puts his own spin on those type of characters. These are some of the most repulsive horror movie villains in history, the most horrifying, the most human, and at the same time some of the most strangely charismatic villains ever in a horror movie. Bill Mosely as Otis Driftwood. Oh man, what a fucking performance that is right there. He's funny, he's kind of charismatic, he's charming, but he's absolutely frightening, and the way that he has such calm control over every situation when he's carrying out the most horrific of deeds only elevates it. I love Sherry Moon Zombie as Baby. She does a great job of doing a Harley Quinn-esque over-the-top type of horror movie villain. Yeah. And of course, the late great Sid Haig as Captain Spaulding. He just fucking pops off the screen. The greasy makeup, the boisterous voice, the personality, and it's funny, he doesn't really take very much part in most of the blood and the mayhem in any of these movies, yet he's what sticks out the most in my brain. Yeah. It's exciting from start to finish. It's horrifying in a way that's realistic. It gets under your skin because it's so wrong, but then it makes you laugh. You'll find yourself repulsed and kind of disgusted and driven to anxiety by the awful things you see happening on screen. And then next scene, you're busting out laughing because Rob Zombie's dialogue is so fucking funny. Yeah. And it does a good job of making you very horrified of the Firefly family and these people, but they're such a joy to watch. The way that they react with each other, their personal interplay, they begin to become kind of relatable as a family, and I think that makes them even more scarier, is that when they're not out killing or doing crazy things, you start laughing at them and getting caught up in the drama of their interplay and the way that they react towards each other. It seems like very realistic family relationships. So, really great movie. Good soundtrack, and one of my favorite endings of any horror movie. The Firefly family going out in a blaze of glory, set to Lynyrd Skynyrd's Freebird.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll stab your eardrums with an ice pick.
My number 16, I'm returning back to the werewolf subgenre, An American Werewolf in London from 1981.
A bona fide classic.
Yep. Written and directed by John Landis, who did Trading Places and Animal House. I'll just go through this fairly quickly because I just rewatched this recently and discussed it on the podcast. I showed my 18-year-old son this movie and he absolutely loved it. So do I. It stars David Naughton and Griffin Dunne in the starring roles. It's the quintessential werewolf film. It's polished, but it's still raw enough to be scary and moody. It's funny in its character interaction without being outright comedic. It's amazing practical effects from the great Rick Baker, and it's a layered story with great stars and supporting characters that make it better with each rewatch. So number 16 is American Werewolf in London.
So my number 15 is Audition from 1999, the Japanese horror movie from Takeshi Miike. The reason this is on my list is because it's the perfect slow burn horror movie. If you had no idea what this movie is about and you threw it on the first time, you might think that you're watching a very touching story about a man and his son dealing with the loss of his wife and how he deals with grief and slowly gets back out into the dating world and discovers himself. And for a while, it functions as a straightforward kind of touching melodrama about grief, and then it starts to go into much darker territory that I wouldn't say that it's torture porn. It's definitely not torture porn, but it definitely veers into the torture subgenre. So the main character starts to hold auditions to be a new candidate, to be his new girlfriend, his new wife, his new lover, whatever you want to call it. But the way that he does it is very cruel and very wrong. He has his buddy, who is in the film industry, organize auditions for a part in a movie, and his plan is to audition a bunch of women for a non-existent part, and whoever he falls for the most, he's going to slowly break it to her that the movie's not going to get made after all, but we still can be friends, and try to insinuate his way into her life. And that's where the horror of the movie begins. You begin to see what seemed like a character who is very likable. You get to see his more controlling aspects, and you get to see some of the misogyny inherent in Japanese culture. And I think this is very much a feminist horror film that has to do with feminist themes. You see him and his friend earlier in the movie discussing women in Japan, how loud they are now, how they're not very obedient. They have a very specific idea of what a woman should be, and it's very quiet and demure and submissive, and they believe that they're entitled to this, and it's that very entitlement that all the horror is drawn from. Asami is the woman that he falls in love with, but she has a dangerous past and a history of abuse. And as the movie unfolds, you see him falling for her, and it seems like she's falling for him too. But then you realize that she knows that she's being taken advantage of, and you start to see a lot of her dark side come out. It's kind of disturbing. This is going to put a lot of people off, or a lot of people are going to find it sick or morally reprehensible, because you start to see little elements of the sadistic abuse she received as a child. And it's even suggested that a lot of it was sexual abuse. And if you realize that by the end of the movie, if he had been more honest with his intentions about who he was, he might have had a chance with this girl. The movie plays out a dream sequence where you get to see, the clock rewinds back for a little bit after all the horrible aftermath, and you see them handling the situation and dealing with each other in much more honest ways. And you realize that if he didn't have these certain types of expectation on women, and if he didn't dishonestly try to woo her into his life, things could have worked out much better for both of them. So it's a good movie about the misunderstandings between men and women in Japan and how culture is over there. And it has a great sequence of torture. A piano razor wire is used very effectively in this to saw a foot off. And through the entire torture process, he's paralyzed and he can't even speak up. So you get to see very slow torture play out very graphically. Really disturbing movie, and one of the scariest scenes I've ever seen in a movie is where Asami is sitting by herself in her apartment, crouched in a very strange position with the phone on one side of the camera angle, and on the other side you just see a bag that's just like a lump, and she's just sitting in the most weird position, and then the phone starts to ring, and you realize she's been waiting for the call back to her audition, and then the phone's ringing and it's very still, and you wonder, why isn't she going? She's acting very strange, and then the bag just moves and you realize that there's a body in there. It has very unique atmosphere, and it builds up very slowly. You see the tension mount and mount and mount and mount until it reaches a fever pitch. It's a deeply disturbing movie with interesting themes, great acting, and for me, I haven't seen all of Takashi Miike's films just because he's made over 100 of them. Yeah. It's hard to keep up with everything he's ever done. But of the ones that I've seen, this is my favorite one.
All right, my number 15 is a movie that's very personal to me. I'm convinced that no one in the world loves it as much as I do. It's Severance from 2006. It's a slasher film.
Oh, that's really high.
Yeah, from slasher film from the UK. This one feels very personal to me. This is another one of those that I show to nearly everyone that comes to my house, and hardly anyone has ever heard of it. And then after we watch it, they always like it. It's always good, but no one just absolutely adores it like I do. It's directed and co-written by Christopher Smith, who just has his finger on my pulse as a horror fan. He made Triangle, which I also love. And it's co-written by James Moran, who went on to do another UK horror comedy, Cockneys vs. Zombies. The big standouts in an ensemble cast here is Danny Dyer. He's a British actor. He's really good, really funny, really charming. And the American Laura Harris from The Faculty. And it's about a weapons company who goes on a team building retreat and are hunted down and killed in various creative and gory ways. At first you think it's just a slasher in the woods, your standard slasher. The British ensemble cast, and the fact that they're all co-workers kind of brings a different element to it. And then it's slowly revealed who the killers are, and it's very entertaining, and it gives another layer to the film after you find out who they are. It has a lot to do with this being a weapons company, hint hint.
Shut up.
There's a reason for the killing, and it's compelling and kind of funny what the reasons are. So it'd be a disservice to the movie if I told you what that was, but just check it out and see the little twist at the end when you find out who these killers are. It has a fresh energy, and it's a blast to watch every time. I've probably watched this more than I have a lot of the classics. It's just something about it that's so me.
Tune in to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast, or I'll slice your fingers off.
Coming at number 14 is an absolute classic of the genre. It is A Nightmare on Elm Street from Wes Craven, the original Freddy Krueger movie. Why this is on my list? I think it's pretty obvious. Freddy Krueger is one of the most memorable horror movie icons in history.
Yeah.
Unlike Jason or unlike Michael, he has a very well-defined personality. The way that he devises scenarios to kill the teenagers is wholly original and unprecedented in the slasher subgenre. You could definitely see how at the time when this came out, this would have reinvigorated the slasher subgenre, because you had films like Friday the 13th, Sleepaway Camp, and even Happy Birthday to Me, where there's all these good horror films, but they became good slasher movies, but there became such an abundance of them that the formula started to play itself out really fast. Wes Craven made the most original slasher film up to that point by injecting supernatural elements into it and by injecting the dream world into it. The fact that Freddy Krueger is not a villain who is physically there, he doesn't exist in the real world, the idea that he can only kill you through your dreams is very compelling, and it makes for some great cinematic set pieces. The boiler room that's underneath the ground and the general dreamlike state that the movie gives you. Freddy Krueger has a personality in here, but it's not like how it became in later movies, where it became a little bit more of a slapstick thing, where it became a little bit more jokey. This Freddy seems like he's having fun tormenting all the kids, but he's a lot more menacing than he ended up being in a lot of the later sequels. You could tell Freddy is very serious, and it has one of the greatest kill scenes in horror movie history. It pulled something of a Psycho, well, not to the same extent, by having Tina's character being introduced as the main character, as sort of like the heroine of the movie. And the scene where she finally falls asleep and feels safe, she encounters Freddy Krueger in her dreams in an alley, and then you get to see her body sleeping, and then you get to see it slowly rise up out of the bed while her boyfriend's there not knowing what to do, being pummeled around, being tossed around the room, and you see it being dragged up the wall and across the ceiling. Is so visually imaginative. I don't think there had ever been a slasher movie kill quite like that. It takes surrealistic, dreamlike imagery and injects them into a real world situation. Yeah. It's just Tina being dragged across the ceiling, and she's bleeding, and you could see that she's being slashed away at, and she's struggling, but you don't see Freddy there. Such a great piece of imagery and a great little feat of filmmaking, the way that they accomplished it by having rooms that were able to turn upside down and go in all kinds of different directions. Flipping the camera certain ways makes it seem like she's actually being drugged up against the ceiling. Really great stuff. Robert Englund is menacing in the movie. He's funny. He's the perfect dream villain. Heather Langenkamp as Nancy, one of the great final girls in history. One of the most empowered final girls, I would say. That's a good thing that Wes Craven did. His final girls were a lot more stronger and took hold of the situation. Of course, you got baby Johnny Depp in here in his first film role. Complete blast as a horror movie. It has moments that are genuinely scary. It has moments that are fun. It's no wonder that it became an indelible piece of popular culture. Freddy Krueger is one of the most referenced characters in popular culture. The design of him, the sweater, the burnt face, the fedora hat.
Yeah.
And of course, the knives for fingers glove. What Wes Craven did is he reinvigorated the slasher subgenre and added supernatural elements to it. And he also made the weapon more interesting, because most of the time it's a regular butcher knife or something like that. The fact that his is a glove fitted with knives for fingers is very unique when you think about it. It's become so a part of pop culture, Freddy's glove, that we kind of take for granted what an original weapon that was at the time. One of the greatest horror movies of all time, an unquestionable classic, a Halloween staple. All those reasons, Nightmare on Elm Street is number 14 on my list.
I love how it's so fun, but it came out around the time, mid 80s, when a lot of iconic blockbusters came out, a lot of quality dramas, and it stands alongside all the great horror films, but it also stands along all the great cinema of the time. It stands right next to them. It's a great cinematic achievement and also a really fun horror film.
You're listening to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
Well, my number 14 is just as fun to me, but it doesn't have as much of a fun nature. From 2015, The Witch, written and directed by Robert Eggers.
You sick bastard. I think that's fun. No, I'm just kidding. Go on.
One of our greatest horror voices right now, and one that seems like he's going to get better with each film, because I think The Lighthouse is arguably better than The Witch, but I have to watch it many more times because I've already watched The Witch tons of times, at least 10 times since it's been out. It's set in the 1630s about a family that's exiled into the forest where witches and a goat named Black Phillip slowly consume them with evil. Probably more than any movie on my list, this score stands out as being one of the major reasons why this is so effective. It's the score, the directing, the acting, they're all spot on. It's strange and it holds up on repeat viewings. It's spine-tingling from beginning to end. A great breakout performance from Anna Taylor-Joy. And this is one, if you are fans of this podcast, you've heard us talk about this one.
Gush over this film over and over.
So we constantly talk about this movie. So if you'll listen to the rest of the podcast, you'll see why that The Witch from Robert Eggers is my number 14.
The instant I saw it, I got the same feeling that I got from Hereditary that I described with Hereditary, but to an even greater degree. And I'll save my conversation about it for later, but I will say this. When I'd seen it, I instantly knew the minute it was over, it was one of my very, very favorite horror movies of all time. It didn't take repeat viewings. Most movies take a long time for them to cement their status. This one, I knew the instant it was over. And I knew while I was watching it, it was going to be one of my favorite movies. For me, the best horror movie of the decade.
And I think one of the main reasons why it's divisive is it relies on the viewer to let it in. If you let it in, this will deeply affect you. If you don't, you'll be bored with it and you won't be concerned about anything about it, and you'll probably hate it like a lot of horror fans did. It affected me so much when I watched it the first time. I was like, there's no way this could hold up on repeat viewings.
Oh, it absolutely holds up. I feel the exact same experience every time I watch it. It's never been diminished.
You think the horror is going to dilute somehow on repeat viewings, but it doesn't. Even though you know everything that's going to happen, it still almost feels like a surprise when it happens.
So my number 13 film is another Wes Craven film, Scream. Now this one actually surprised me. I wrestled with this in my head. I was actually shocked when I put my list together and I was ranking my favorites and I saw Scream come out ahead of Nightmare on Elm Street. And there's a part of me that said, that feels really wrong. That doesn't feel right. But then the more I thought about it, I was like, I need to be completely honest with myself. While I love A Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream holds just a slight edge over it, and a lot of it has to do with nostalgia. I feel like Scream is to me what A Nightmare on Elm Street was to the previous generations, because I grew up in the 90s, I didn't grow up in the 80s. So in the 80s, Freddy would have been your horror movie icon, or Jason. The Scream franchise is what I grew up with. I think it's just one of the great horror movies of all time. It's a great satirical horror comedy. It's a great comedy that functions just as well as a horror movie. I love that it's very kidding towards the genre. It kind of makes fun of horror a little bit. It has fun with it, it teases it, but at the same time, it delivers a fantastic horror film. Part of what makes it such a joy for me, is that when you're watching it, it acknowledges how silly some of horror is, but then after acknowledging how silly it is, it says, look, it may be silly, but we're going to pull that same thing that we were just making fun of, and we're going to show you just how well it works. I'm thinking of the scene where Neve Campbell is on the phone, and she's mocking horror movies, saying they're all the same. It's some big-breasted bimbo who should be running out the front, who's running up the stairs when she'd be running out the front door, and it's pretty insulting. And then it happens to her right after, where she has to run up the stairs, and it's a little funny, but it's so effective at the same time. It has the greatest opening scene in horror movie history. If I had to search my heart for what I think is the greatest opening scene in horror movies, it has to be Drew Barrymore getting the call from Ghostface at the beginning of Scream. Because if you remove that opening scene from the rest of the movie, it would be one of the greatest horror short films of all time. That scene can live and breathe and function on its own. The iconic image of seeing Drew Barrymore pick up the phone, the line of "What's your favorite scary movie?" Within 13 minutes, the movie draws you in very fast. It slowly starts to ramp up its tension, and then it just fucking hits you with a brutal slasher kill that kind of feels very shocking. And I love the way that it's shot too. The way that the movie opens up, you see the first frame is of a phone ringing, and then you see a hand reach out to grab it, and it's Drew Barrymore. And she answers the phone. She says, "Oh, you got the wrong number." She hangs up. It seems like there's nothing wrong. It cuts to a shot outside of her swing set on her front yard, and it's very gently swinging back and forth, and instantly you know, ooh, something's about to happen just by that single suggested image. Then the phone rings again, and she goes to answer it, but once she goes to answer it, the camera angle is different. It's a little bit more skewed to the side. It's a Dutch angle, and it's a little disorienting. And when she picks up the phone the second time, you start to get the feeling that something is very off that's about to happen. Then she starts talking to the stranger on the phone, and they just start discussing horror movies, and it's very funny. They start talking about Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street, and while she's doing it, she's making that Jiffy Pop, that popcorn that was really popular in the night. I don't really see it anymore, where you make it on a stove and the package slowly starts to get bigger and bigger, the way that popcorn does when you put it in the microwave. While she's talking to the killer, the popcorn is cooking, and it keeps getting bigger and bigger, and the tension of the scene escalates as the popcorn keeps cooking higher and higher and higher. So you see it going on all at once, where Drew Barrymore is flirting with a stranger, and then he says something really creepy, and then the bag gets bigger. Then she starts panicking, and then the bag gets bigger until it catches on fire and starts a little fire in the house. It's all of the editing, all of the shots, the way that it plays out, the way that it reveals the gore, the way that within 3 minutes you go from slightly amused to very scared, the selection of camera angles. It is just a masterclass in filmmaking. If you want to know how to direct a slasher movie or a horror movie, study the opening scene of Scream. Study every single shot. And you could tell Wes Craven had a blast making this. You had Kevin Williamson's great screenplay that's funny, it's satirical, it has sharp dialogue, memorable characters, and I feel like these characters are more memorable than most slasher movie victims. They have more personality, more spunk, more fight, more fire in them. And of course, Neve Campbell, like Heather Langenkamp in A Nightmare on Elm Street, she is a very elevated scream queen, a very elevated final girl, where you don't get the sense that she's weak. She fights back, she's strong, and she has a lot of pluck. You get the feeling that she is formidable enough to go up against toe-to-toe with Ghostface. The work of two minds that absolutely love the horror genre, and that love just bleeds throughout the entire movie. An exciting, thrilling, funny horror movie.
My number 13, I'm going to return to John Carpenter. It's In the Mouth of Madness from 1994. Directed by Carpenter and written by Michael DeLuca, who was also the producer. It's about an insurance investigator played by Sam Neill, who discovers that a writer's books are turning people into murderous psychopaths. It starts out very psychological and gets more and more horror fantasy throughout, and I love that. I love the slow progression of it. And I love the mutant children, the mutated old lady. It feels very Stephen King, but it also feels very Lovecraft. The town of Hobbs End, that's when it started feeling Lovecraft to me. The events leading up to it, all the Sutter Kane stuff, felt very Stephen King, but once they got into the mutations and stuff, it felt very Lovecraft. It's an excellent nightmare world that's always effective every time you watch it. It's unexpected from John Carpenter, very layered. I love the visuals, the acting, the scares, the humor in it, the dark humor.
Sam Neill.
Some great, very effective.
Another appearance from Sam Neill on our list.
Yeah. And especially that scene where he's sitting there talking to the guy at a little cafe.
And you see the bum character like approaching them, and they aren't even aware of what's going on.
Yeah.
But you as an audience member are aware. You're like, pay attention, pay attention. Comes crashing through. That's great stuff right there. I think Sam Neill has a knack for picking out unique horror movies. Because if you think about what we talked about just on this podcast, Possession, Event Horizon, and In the Mouth of Madness, these are not typical horror movies that follow any kind of formula. Nothing about them feels standard. They're all horror movies, but they're some of the most unique horror movies in the history of the genre. This was not in my top 25, but it was in my top 50. I do think it's John Carpenter's his most unique film, the most nightmarish, and it's ballsy and it's audacious. And like I said last time, I think it's very unfortunate that it took so long for it to get the type of following that it did.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll cut your nose off and feed it to my goldfish.
My number 12 is The Texas Chainsaw Massacre from Tobe Hooper. When I put this list together, I was shocked it wasn't in my top 10, but that's just how much I love a lot of the movies that are above it. It's the grittiest fucking horror movie I've ever seen. And what's interesting about it is that it inspired a wave of a certain type of horror film. Gritty, nasty, gory, and relentlessly violent. This movie isn't gory and it's not relentlessly violent, but it feels like it is while you're watching it, and that is a great achievement. There's very little blood in the movie, but you feel like you've seen a slaughter fest once it's over. It does such a good job of building the tension the whole way through. And I think what also contributes to the movie is the aesthetic of the film itself. It looks very cheap, grainy, and it looks like a beaten up film print, but it feels very raw and elemental. Leatherface is one of the greatest horror movie icons of all time, and what makes him so great in this movie is that there's something about him that's vaguely innocent. You get the sense that when he's running around at the beginning of the movie, he starts slaughtering these teenagers, but it's not like he's some kind of maniac like Michael Myers or Jason who goes out in search of teenagers. These kids showed up to his house and interrupted his flow of life and what was going on, and so he ends up starting to kill these kids, and there's more and more start to show up at the house. You could see that Leatherface is panicking and like being like, where the hell did all these people come from? Who are, like, why are they breaking? And you could tell he doesn't want to do that.
Yeah.
The house that Leatherface lives in is one of the greatest locations in any horror movie, and it has such a really cool macabre imagery. All the furniture and everything around it is designed out of human body parts, human skulls, and you get the sense that Leatherface is an artist. You get this feeling that if he were raised in a different family, he might have been a sensitive artist, but he was raised with a pack of cannibals, so his artistry went in much more dark and macabre directions, but you get this feeling that he's a sensitive soul, the way that he's chased around by their grandpa and the way that he seems really scared. There's no other film that has the atmosphere that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre had. Because when Tobe Hooper took out his crew and his cast to film this movie, it was unbearably hot. The actors were having a miserable time. It was really sweaty. The house that they were filming in stunk really badly, and it was driving people mad. So by the end of the film, when you see Marilyn Burns strapped to the chair, and she's surrounded by all of the family, and it seems like they're all fucking losing their minds. It keeps cutting back and forth between all the reaction shots of each family member, of them acting extra grotesque, the close-ups of her eyeball as it starts twitching, that slicing sound that keeps coming through the soundtrack. There's a certain, and the editing gets faster and it gets more chaotic, and after a while you don't feel like you're watching actors, you feel like you're watching people go fucking mad before your very eyes, and the editing style and the selection of shots helps to convey this even more, and then the music that's underneath it all. So it's a very deceptive movie because it looks really cheap in its construction, but if you pay attention, it is masterfully constructed and uses its aesthetic to bring out the horror even more, to put you in the raw feeling of that situation. I love the part where a young woman is put upon a hook. You don't actually see her get put on a hook, but she is put on a hook. Everything about it seems a lot more gory and graphic than it actually is. But when you watch the film and take it scene by scene, very little blood in it. I don't know how Tobe Hooper managed to pull that off. Feel to it, it's very grimy. The scene where Leatherface comes out the first time and he smacks the kid in the head with the mallet, and then just shuts the door behind him. It's genuinely startling.
Cool. You know that one's coming up on my list. But not at number 12. My number 12 is The Conjuring from 2013. And if anybody knows me, they know that I'm a Conjuring nerd. I hate to break it to a lot of horror fans that shit on this movie for being too commercial. It came out in 2013, and it's still one of the greatest haunted house movies ever made. There have been many great ones, but this is one of the best. I don't care if it just came out recently. I don't care if it's a crowd pleaser. I don't care if you think James Wan has too many jump scares. This guy is a master, and I think he proved it with this movie. I mean, Insidious is good. Saw is great. But this one is when he really came full circle and showed what a great filmmaker he was. It's written by Chad and Carrie Hayes. It stars Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson as the Warrens. The other standout performances are Lily Taylor, Joey King, and Ron Livingston as the dad. It's about the Perron family, and it's set in Rhode Island in 1971. It's an excellent period piece. It's frightening when we thought we had seen everything in haunted house movies. The jump scares are done right. I mean, he's known for his jump scares for a reason, because I know when James Wan came out and he became huge, horror became very saturated with jump scares. Almost no one does it right. James Wan crafts them perfectly. It's great setups. The setups are sometimes just as scary as the scares themselves. The drama is awesome and it's very emotional. To me, it has an air of authenticity. It's great cinematography, and I love the way Wan makes the best out of his locations and makes the locations very much a part of the story. One of the main things I love about this is the Warrens feel like the Warrens. Loved the Warren stories ever since I was a junior in high school when I did my term paper on ghosts, and I ended up doing almost the whole term paper on the Warrens. There could not be a better Ed and Lorraine Warren than Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson. They embody who those people are. I think they embody their connection as a husband and wife, and they embody their struggle to not only be helpful to the families they were helping, but be taken seriously, because still to this day they are called frauds and fakes and manipulators, but I do not think this. That's one of many reasons why my number 12 is The Conjuring by James Wan, 2013.
My number 11 is from 1977, Eraserhead by David Lynch. This is a horror movie that is very much a horror movie, even though, like most of David Lynch's work, I don't think it was consciously designed to be a horror movie. It just is. And why this is number 11 on my list? I don't think any other film has ever used cinematic language so successfully to tap into nightmare logic and the kind of imagery and atmosphere that could only ever be produced in a dream state or by the subconscious mind. It's the subconscious mind run amok on film. The open-ended nature and ambiguity allows one to delve in, dissect, and analyze the meanings and various interpretations the way you would analyze your own dreams. It's totally otherworldly for me. This is David Lynch's feature film debut, and he creates a world so confidently and so effectively that it's hard to believe that this is the work of a debut filmmaker. Every little part of this movie is deeply uncomfortable, and it reminds me of some of the most awkward nightmares that I've ever had in my life. It traps you inside of an actual nightmare, not the way that a lot of movies do where there's nightmare sequences and you feel like you're just watching somebody trying to direct a nightmare. This feels like it is an actual nightmare put on film. It deals with Henry Spencer, played by the great Jack Nance, as a very awkward, I wouldn't even describe it, just an awkward person who fathers a baby with Mary X, that's the name of the character. Who I think the film is about the fear of fatherhood, because the baby that comes out is a deformed mutant freak that doesn't look like anything you're remotely even resembling humanity. And it's such a great little creation that David Lynch pulled off with this baby. It's slimy, it's wet, it's gross. It was achieved practically, and to this day, David Lynch will not say what he did to design the baby, because the baby was created by Lynch himself, and nobody knows how he actually created it. There's so many bizarre scenes in this movie that just get under the skin. I'm thinking of the scene where Henry is at the house of Mary X, the woman who he's impregnated, and it's like the nightmare version of having to meet the in-laws or having to meet your significant other's parents. It's supremely awkward. Everything goes wrong. The father is so friendly and so nice that it veers into being very sinister. The mother is very menacing. The chickens don't make any sense. There's chickens that they're supposed to be eating, but they're like the size of a hand. There's no chickens that are like the size of the hand, and they squirt pus out. They look like they're bleeding. A lot of inexplicable things happen. So many strange frames, the lighting, the shadows. It bypasses language and goes directly to your subconscious mind and makes you feel emotions and feelings that are not exactly easy to put into words. Kind of works the way that a painting works, like a moving painting plunging you inside a nightmare and a piece of paranoia. I'm not going to talk about it that much more, just because I can't really put into words the effect that this movie has on me. You have to see it on your own to understand what makes it a great film or what makes it such a masterpiece. Eraserhead is number 11, just outside my top 10. And the reason this isn't in my top 10 is because as a film, I think it might be better than some of the movies in my top 10. As a film. As a horror movie, there's just stuff that I have to put above it. But it is a great horror movie, no doubt.
I had an interesting experience with Eraserhead, where the first time I attempted to watch it was back in the 90s, and I was thoroughly disturbed by it and felt very dirty and wrong, and
I
never got to finish it. I had to take off somewhere, and I never felt compelled to return to it because I was a little scared by it, because I was really deeply disturbed by it the first time I watched it. And then when I watched it with you, it's been years later, I found it very whimsical and
mesmerizing.
Beautiful. Yeah.
I think that's what makes it such an effective horror movie, is that the imagery seems like stuff that, yes, it could only come from nightmares, and if you saw it in real life, it would give you anxiety, but it's beautiful at the same time, too.
You're listening to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show Podcast.
Okay, my number 11. Back to John Carpenter again. Halloween, 1978. Always loved this movie since the first time I watched it. And
that's your number 11?
Yes.
Oh, interesting.
Directed, of course, by the great John Carpenter. Co-written by Deborah Hill, who also wrote The Fog and Escape from L.A. And it stars Jamie Lee Curtis, who's the daughter of Janet Leigh from Psycho, Donald Pleasance, P.J. Soles, and the William Shatner mask. That was a major star of this. It was originally called The Babysitter Murders, and it was much more serious, and then it became more of a
slasher movie.
And it is one of the finest slashers in history. It's scary, suspenseful, superbly crafted, got great music from the director John Carpenter. The mask was very effective, and it's the epitome of everything it is. It's the epitome of the slasher killer. It's the epitome of the final girl. It's the epitome of a horror score. I first discovered this, I was a little kid in the 70s, and I went to a yard sale, and the novelization was this movie was sitting there, and I seen that iconic image of that poster with the jack-o'-lantern with the knife. It's the perfect horror poster, the perfect name. I'm glad they made it Halloween instead of the Babysitter Murders. It's funny to find out that the only reason why they named it Halloween is for budget purposes. They needed to keep it confined into one area on one night, and the best way to do that was to make it set on Halloween,
the scariest night of the year.
Yeah, which made it so iconic and so effective. The feeling that poster gave me, and then the feeling that the novelization gave me, is the exact same feeling I got when I watched it. Superbly crafted, where it's great achievement as cinematic art, and that's why number 11 is Halloween from 1978.
Coming in at number 10 for me is Suspiria from 1977. This is how I would describe Suspiria. A surrealist fantasia, a completely irrational nightmare world that makes sense only on an emotional level. The over-the-top imagery, operatic vibe, bombastic score, unbelievable candy color make it seem otherworldly. The style does a good job of working the viewer into a heightened, frenzied, and jangled state of mind. It's like being dropped into a nightmare world on acid, and like a nightmare, it barely makes sense, but that's the beauty. The overall style of the movie helps to continue the feeling of what it would be like to start losing your mind on LSD. At least that's how I interpret it anyway. So that really doesn't tell you very much about the movie itself. It takes place in a haunted German ballet academy run by a coven of witches, and it revolves around a young American student from New York who's studying ballet there. Her name is Susie Banyan, played by Jessica Harper. Now, this is another one where it's hard to put into words because up front, I don't think that the script for Suspiria is particularly inventive or original. If you really break down and look at the script, there's nothing very groundbreaking about its storyline or the way that it's written, but as a piece of art, as a horror film, it's completely groundbreaking. I'll start off with the musical score. The score by Goblin is not what you would expect from a horror movie score. A lot of horror movie scores are atmospheric, and they build some type of tension that kind of goes up and up, or they have a very creepy, quiet quality like John Carpenter's score for Halloween. This score sounds really, really over the top. Things that are you hear a lot of like drum beats and a lot of jangling and rattling and weird voices that kind of peer out in the soundtrack. It's kind of like a very inventive soundscape that's deeply unmelodic and doesn't have any harmony to it, but it's very crucial in contributing to the sense that the film gives you. Then you have Dario Argento's imagery. Most horror movies are really dark in terms of the way that they're lit. This one is beautiful to look at. It looks like a piece of pop art. It's candy colored, it's glossy, all the reds pop, all the blue, everything about it is just so color corrected within an inch of its life that it doesn't look like anything close to resembling reality. The blood in this movie looks like candy-colored paint, and it doesn't really make sense, but it helps to heighten the movie that you're watching. It has one of the greatest opening scenes in horror movie history, is when Susie Bannion is arriving at the academy, and one of the girls gets strung up and hung from the ceiling of the academy. The setup is so strange, and the way that it ends with her just hanging from the ceiling, and the pounding drum score that's going on in the background, all the whooshes and the weird sounds, the hyperactive imagery puts you in a very fevered, heightened state of mind. Like Eraserhead, it's kind of surreal, but where Eraserhead is really slow and cerebral in the way that it drives you into the nightmare, Suspiria rattles you and grabs you by the shoulders and shakes you violently. If you ever have a chance to see Suspiria on the big screen, please do so. To see those beautiful images being projected on a large screen, and to be in a theater with a good sound system where you could hear every little detail of the soundtrack is disorienting in a way that's really hard to put into words. It's the perfect realization of Dario Argento's style. It's a witch movie that doesn't feel like a witch movie at all.
Yeah.
It feels closer to a slasher movie, but that doesn't even fully explain what it is. It has a vibe all its own, and it creates a world unlike anything else seen in horror. And it's just beautiful. The way that the color scheme changes, there's some rooms in this movie where it's completely just blue, deep blues. Other parts where you see deep greens. All the colors are ultra saturated, and they kind of remind me of the way that Technicolor used to look in the 1960s and 1950s, but pumped up and exaggerated to an even greater degree. Dario Argento has never been great as a storyteller. I've never found him to be a very coherent storyteller, except in something like Deep Red. But we don't go to Argento for the storytelling. We go for the vibe, the atmosphere, the feeling that he gives us. We go because we want to be shaken and rattled as horror fans, and this movie does that perfectly. It works magic. It is pure cinematic magic, one of the truly most unique horror movies in existence, and for me, the pinnacle of Dario Argento's career. And for that reason, Suspiria cracked my top 10 horror films of all time.
Now we begin my top 10 with one that was already on your list, A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984.
Slightly higher.
Written and directed by Wes Craven, of course starring the great Heather Langenkamp, Robert Englund as Freddy, Johnny Depp's first role, Amanda Weiss, and John Saxon as the dad, another great performance by the great John Saxon. This is when Freddy Krueger was scary. He was funny in this, but he was mostly scary. One of the best final girls and one of the best final fights with the final girl. And here's a list of the many things that I love about this movie and the many things that stick out in my mind. The claw when it comes up between Nancy's legs in the tub. Love that scene, iconic for a reason. The tongue on the phone when he says, "I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy." Tina's bloody death that you mentioned when it was on your list.
Oh yeah, one of the greatest horror movie kills in history.
Yeah, and then Glenn, Johnny Depp's even bloodier death, with all that tons of gallons and gallons of blood being poured into the ceiling. Freddy's long arms in the alley, and I found out that was achieved by attaching the arms to Freddy, and then there were guys on each side of the alley with fishing poles holding up the arms. And that was always one of the most effective and one of the scariest scenes. Still,
one of the weirdest images you've ever seen in a horror movie.
Yeah. Every time, I've seen this countless times, and still to this day, when he comes running down that alley with his arms outstretched, I'm like, "Bah!"
And the way that
same sound every time.
His knife scratch on and the screeching against the trash can.
Yes, all the booby traps that Nancy sets in her house to capture Freddy when she brings him out of the dream world. The blade scraping up against all the boiler room pipes. The 1-2 Freddy's coming for you nursery rhyme.
Oh, I forgot to mention that. That contributes so much to it. It's so creepy to have the 1-2 Freddy's coming for you.
Yeah.
That weird sing-songy, almost like bedtime lullaby.
And I found out that Heather Langenkamp's boyfriend at the time is the one that came up with that little nursery rhyme. It's interesting. And then I absolutely love Nancy's daydream during school when she sees Tina in the body bag come to the door.
That's one of the scariest scenes in the movie, and I forgot to bring that up when I was talking about it. There's too many things to try to remember all at once of what makes A Nightmare on Elm Street so great.
Yeah, between seeing her friend try to speak to her through the body bag and then seeing it being dragged through the halls with blood behind it, ugh. So good.
Some of the greatest sequences in any horror movie.
Yeah, and then that the great finale where John Saxon is fighting Freddy's skeleton. So that's why my number 10 is A Nightmare on Elm Street, 1984.
Unquestionably one of the great horror classics of all time.
Yeah.
My number 9 is The Exorcist from 1973, directed by the great William Friedkin, based on the novel by William Peter Blatty. I feel like it's hard to talk about The Exorcist because what is there to be said that hasn't been said before, but I'm going to try anyway. I think what makes this film work so well, and I think that its reputation is as the scariest horror movie of all time. Whether or not you agree with that statement or with that assessment, it surely deserves to be in the conversation, and I think I know why. The movie is about a very supernatural unfolding, a very supernatural, deeply disturbing event about a little girl being possessed by the demon Pazuzu. And it's a very fantastic story when you stop and think about it, but the film is shot almost with a certain type of gritty realism. It reminds me a little bit of, I don't know, something like Taxi Driver in terms of the way that it's shot. It doesn't feel when you're watching it, you don't feel like you're watching a fantasy world unfold, or you don't feel like you're watching a movie that's just designed to scare you. You look like you're watching something happen. The way that Regan looks when she's possessed, and the way that her body flings across the bed, and the way that it keeps jumping up and down, the way that the actual exorcism scenes goes, the way she's lifting off the bed, you are watching something that seems physically tangible, like it's actually there. It doesn't feel like a lot of horror movies, and a lot of great horror movies that are supernatural have a very heightened supernatural vibe. Nothing about it feels supernatural, and I can only imagine how some of the imagery in this movie would have fucked with people really badly at the time when it came out. I'm sure it was unprecedented to see a little girl stab herself in her private parts with a crucifix, screaming obscenities like "Let Jesus fuck you."
Shut your mouth or I'll rip your lips off.
I can only imagine what it must have been like, because if you think about the types of horror movies, or even some of the more demonic or satanic horror movies that preceded The Exorcist, you think of something like Rosemary's Baby, which is a great film and one that I actually have a little bit of a preference for, but it doesn't have that same type of in-your-face quality to it. There's never been anything quite like The Exorcist. I don't think there's ever been a movie that made the supernatural as real as this one, and it's so involving that you kind of forget that you're watching a movie at times. The power of some of the images, of course, that iconic score, the great opening scene where Father Karras is off in, was it Iraq?
Yeah, I think.
Gives when he's searching for different artifacts, gives the movie a more mythic quality. You get to see the statue of the demon Pazuzu, and you get to see the priest facing it, and the movie lets you know right from the beginning that these two will meet again at some point. The ultimate good versus the ultimate evil will square off, and the image lets you know right off the bat. So it's simultaneously mythic and kind of fabled, but grounded in realism and a physical tangibility that I don't think has ever been repeated with the supernatural horror film. I think a lot of movies have tried to do what The Exorcist does, but none of them have ever made the supernatural feel so real.
That opening scene where they show the statue, you get this feeling of evil that kind of stays with you through the whole movie, and then it comes back again when Regan gets possessed. So it's two completely different situations that bring up the same feeling of evil. It feels like the same demonic presence is in that opening scene as in when
definitely.
It possesses Regan.
People tell me that they don't think it's scary, or they don't think it's dated. I have a hard time really comprehending that, because every time I watch, I'm like, this makeup, these effects, the special effects, nothing about this has aged in the slightest in my view. And of course, the voice that comes out of Regan's mouth contributes to the overall feeling.
Oh yeah.
Great piece of filmmaking.
My number 9 is quite a few years newer than your number 9. It's The Descent from 2005, and this is another one, if you know me, you know that this is one of my absolute favorite films. Written and directed by Neil Marshall. I mentioned his first film, Dog Soldiers, earlier in my list, and I didn't think he could get any better than Dog Soldiers, but this is even better. I won't go into it too deep because I went over this when we did our favorite movies of the 2000s, from 2000 to 2009, and this was definitely at the top. So the standouts for me is Natalie Mendoza as Juno, Shauna McDonald as Sarah, and Alex Reed as Beth in this great ensemble cast of women. It's about a group of women who are into extreme sports and attempt to explore a cave where no man has ever gone before. And it's amazing that Marshall went from a strong female ensemble cast, a strong male ensemble cast to a strong female ensemble cast, and it's just as effective. And this one's even scarier and even more realistic than Dog Soldiers was. And plus, it's more emotionally complex as well, which contributes to the horror and contributes to the dramatic effect of the film overall. It's visceral, realistic, claustrophobic. The creature design is amazing and looks real. The movements look real and they look scary and original. The characters are great and fun to watch, and it's fun to watch the interaction between them and the drama that arises between them. The setting of the cave is excellent and effective, realistic. The action is top-notch, so it's an excellent fight for survival with a heartbreaking ending that's very effective, that's been copied several times since, but never to the same effect as The Descent. The ultimate claustrophobic horror film, number 9.
It's definitely really anxiety-inducing. Most movies that try to express the feeling of claustrophobia try to do it in a very calm and very oppressive way that slowly starts to make you feel uncomfortable. This one is the type of claustrophobic that smacks you in the face and never relents. It would be like being trapped in a closet with all kinds of hands reaching at you. That's the closest of what I could think of in terms of what the experience of watching The Descent it's like.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll make your dog eat your wife.
My number 8 is Night of the Living Dead, 1968, George A. Romero.
Nice.
My favorite zombie film and one of my favorite horror films of all time. And what's not to love about this movie? It's exciting, it's meaningful, it's a good snapshot of America in 1968, of what was going on in terms of the culture. As the original zombie movie, it does a good job of establishing the lore of establishing zombie lore, and it still feels different from the zombies that came in its wake. These zombies, yes, they're creatures that rise up from the dead, but they have more personality, and they don't look like they're just trying to eat you. Some of them actually try to harm you, such as the fact where the little girl zombie goes and stabs her mother to death. Yeah. I've always found that scene very interesting because I'm like, what does drive them? Because that's not driven by any sort of desire to eat human flesh or to consume. That seems like there was that little girl was holding some type of rage or resentment towards her parents in the movie. And it kind of makes sense. You could see that her parents are trapped in a loveless marriage and don't really trust each other. I think that Dwayne Jones as Ben is one of the greatest protagonists in the history of horror movies. I'm pretty sure at the time it was pretty shocking because other than Sidney Lumet, they really didn't put in the 1960s black males as the leads of horror movies. It was always white people, and I think to see that at the time was quietly groundbreaking without announcing itself or without making a big deal out of it. I like that he's calm, he's composed, he's easy to root for, he's likable, and even though it's never outright stated, you get the sense of racial tension that's going on in the room, especially with one particular character I was talking about, the husband trapped in a loveless marriage with his wife. They have a little girl there. You get the sense that he has a lot of resentment towards Ben for taking control of the situation. He's not used to taking orders from a black person or having to deal with them like that. And the way that he takes hold of the situation as the smartest one in the room is kind of empowering. And I think it speaks volumes about America in 1968, that there's a little bit of subtext in there that's saying that racism is so strong and so powerful in the way that it grips people's minds that there could be an apocalypse of people rising from the dead and eating us all, and those racial animosities would still consume us and end up being our downfall, like it ends up being the downfall of the character's name is Harry. It ends up being his downfall. And I think that that's what makes it interesting, is not just the zombies, is the commentary going on in it. And I think it has one of the great endings in horror movie history, because after Ben kind of emerges triumphant as the only survivor and was able to successfully ward off zombies, when the government and police are finally responding to the situation and hunting the zombies down, they see him and they see that it's very clear that he's not a zombie, that he's a human being, and then they just shoot him in the head, casually and act like they didn't do nothing wrong. And the images after of just seeing his body being dragged away after being unfairly shot, I think must have been very potent in 1968, considering the riots and everything that was going on. So it got into places that were territory that most horror movies at the time didn't explore, that weren't uncomfortable. So there's great social commentary, a great snapshot of America in 1968, but it also works on the level of just being a great drive-in feature and has elements of a trashy movie, even though there's nothing trashy about it. The way that the zombies just feast on everybody. And I think my favorite scene in the movie is when the little girl kills her mom. It's such a beautifully shot scene. The way that she approaches her mom. She's the scariest looking zombie in that movie, in my opinion. The most horrifying looking zombie is the little girl. Yeah. And then you see in the shadows her bringing down that kind of like the pickaxe shovel.
Pickaxe, yeah.
Yeah, she's bringing the pickaxe down and like stabbing her. You only see the silhouette in the shadow of it being stabbed, and black blood, because the black and white just being spread, just hitting the wall over and over again, and it cuts to the looks on her faces and her reaction. Has a very unusual sound design right there, where time seems like it's slowing down. Just one of the most memorable moments in horror movie history. There's so much that makes this movie great, and for that reason, Night of the Living Dead is number 8 on my list of favorite horror movies of all time. Just one of the great horror movies ever made, and it shows why George Romero is so beloved in the genre.
Oh yeah. All right, my number 8 is Sinister from 2012. Love this movie. Directed and co-written by Scott Derrickson, who also did Exorcism of Emily Rose and went on after this to do Doctor Strange. The co-writer is C. Robert Cargill, who came up with the idea for the script after watching The Ring, and he had a nightmare, so he wrote this movie based on a nightmare he had while watching The Ring. Ethan Hawke is of course, the star of this, and he's the main thing that makes this effective. Him and his wife is played by Juliette Rylance, and I love the deputy, John Ransom, who ends up being in Sinister 2, and he's also in It Chapter 2. And Fred Dalton Thompson as the sheriff. It's about Ethan Hawke, who's a true crime writer who moves his family in a house where murders occurred, and he tries to write a book on the murders to revive his career. And he finds a box of Super 8 home movies in the house that features several murders. They're like snuff films. And besides Ethan Hawke, that's probably the most effective part of this movie is the snuff films, because he takes these out of the boxes and watches them one at a time throughout the whole movie, so it kind of sets the tone for the movie and sets the tone for the scares as well. And I thought it was interesting to find out, you can totally tell that when they gave these snuff films to Ethan Hawke, when you see him watching them, he's watching them for the first time. He had not seen these films prior to production, so all the reactions you see from him are
genuine,
yeah. And that's the main thing that scares me about this film is Ethan Hawke, because he looks so terrified in this film. It grounds the scares in some type of realism, because you really feel that he's frightened out of his mind. And the score is excellent and understated. I've never heard a score quite like this. It almost takes like the clips and stuff of the sound that a projector makes and twists them somehow and makes it part of the score. And that really adds to the awesome atmosphere that this movie has from beginning to end. The scares, the setup of the scares are great, and the scares are very effective. And it's an awesome horror villain in Bagul. And it's also interesting when I found out that in the original script that Bagul was supposed to be like a Willy Wonka looking character. And that's why he was able to lure all these children and make them part of his little horde of ghost children. And the director did, I forgot it was a director or writer, did a Google image search. And they seen the image of something that looked like Bagul, and they got the rights to it because they liked it so much. And the ghost children were really great in this, very effective. The family drama between the husband and wife. Some of these scenes between Ethan Hawke and his wife are extremely dramatic and extremely effective. And the plight that Ethan Hawke has, because his wife is understandably upset with him, because things have gone wrong in his career before because of the methods that he uses to write his books. And then he doesn't tell her that he's moving her into the house, to a house where these murders occurred. So he really makes these, it's really his fault that his family is victimized by this demon. The taunting of Ethan Hawke is phenomenal through this. The way the Bagul taunts him and scares him is really frightening. And you can also tell that you actually can't tell, it's very, feels like an R-rated film, but when you really look at it close, there's almost no cursing or sex, and it's still got an R rating. And the filmmakers actually approached it wanting it to be PG-13, but it got an R just because of the content, and they decided to stick with that, and I'm glad they did.
Definitely one of the greatest horror films of the past 10-15 years. One of the standouts.
Yeah, truly scary for me. I'm really scared shitless by this film.
Now, my number 7 film is The Witch from 2015, and it is the film that for me is the scariest and the best horror movie of the decade. More than any other film I've ever seen, I think it gives off the feeling that what you're watching is evil. There seems to be something dark burned into the film of itself, the celluloid. I cannot describe the feeling that I got when I first watched The Witch. I felt chills stand up on the back of my neck. I could feel the goosebumps going on. I could feel my hair standing up. And just the sheer atmosphere of this movie is very overwhelming. Scene by scene, I feel like I'm watching something unholy unfold. I feel like I'm watching something that I shouldn't be watching. Black Phillip, who is kind of a stand-in for Satan in this movie, is strangely enough one of the most interesting horror movie antagonists of all time.
Oh, yeah.
Because the way that the Black Goat is shot and the way that they have him chasing around the little twins in the movie start singing to Black Phillip, Black Phillip, Black Phillip, that song is so eerie. I think Anna Taylor-Joy does a really good job of being the lead in this movie. Once it hits the halfway mark, it has stuff in it that actually made my blood curdle. The most horrifying and intense horror movie scene of the past 10 years is when they're praying over the little boy, and you could tell that something's going very wrong. The little twins are unable to pray, and they become very crippled, and they fall over, and you get the sense that something in the room is stopping them from actually praying. The movie revolves around a very religious family that have been exiled to the wood because they were too pious. Even in a religious community, they were thought of as being too self-righteous.
Shut up.
I don't really think this family is very likable, and I find them a little bit more than a little bit off-putting in their attitude and their demeanor and the way that they approach life. And yet the film is so effectively scary that I still felt for them and still felt their plight, even though I found nothing remotely likable about any of them. I feel like it's easier to make a horror movie involving and scary when you come to care about the characters and they mean a lot to you. For it to be this scary and for me not to have any particular fondness for any of the characters only makes it that much more effective, because you feel that what you're watching is so evil that you would never wish it upon anybody. The score of this movie that you mentioned earlier feels like it's slicing across my skin whenever I listen to it. And this is just a masterpiece from top to bottom. It's hard to believe that Robert Eggers did this as a debut film, because it is so accomplished as a cinematic work of art. It's extremely well filmed. It's very authentic because it takes place hundreds of years ago, and you could tell that they went out of their way to make the clothing and the language and the way the characters speak extremely authentic. So many things that I could say about this movie, and so many reasons that I love it. There is no other film of the 2010s that has scared me as much as The Witch. The instant I was watching it, halfway through, I knew this was my favorite horror movie of all time, not of all time, but of the decade. Even though it wasn't over before it ended, I knew that there was not going to be any other film that gave me the feeling that The Witch did, that really curdled my blood. The closest that any movie came was Hereditary, but even then, that didn't quite match the experience that The Witch gave me. It's just, for me, one of the all-time great horror films. I know it's very divisive and a lot of people hate it and they think it's slow. I actually think it's very fast-paced, and I think it happens really quick. It's just not in a rush to get to its point, and it's not rushing the character development, and it's not rushing the situation. Everything about how the horror unfolds feels organic. It doesn't feel like it's too slow moving. And for all of the hate that The Witch gets, and I know it has a lot of hate out there, I think 20, 30 years from now, it's going to be universally revered the way that The Exorcist or The Shining is revered.
Well, one of my favorite movies of the decade just came out in 2016, The Conjuring 2, directed by James Wan, and I think this is his best work. It'll be really a challenge for him to try to top this, because I don't see it happening. It's written once again by Chad and Carrie Hayes, with some additional writing from James Wan himself, and also David Leslie Johnson, who wrote The Orphan. Again, Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga reprise their roles as the Warrens. Madison Wolfe is great in it as Janet, the little girl. Frances O'Connor as the mom, Peggy. And Simon McBurney as Maurice Gross, the paranormal investigator. And Franca Potente as the skeptic. The Conjuring had great cinematography, but I think this was even better. It's based in 1977 in North London. It's based on the Enfield poltergeist, which is a very high-profile paranormal case in England. It's an even better and more effective period piece. It's emotionally engaging, and it's even more emotionally engaging than the first one, and the Warrens' connection seems even stronger in this one. It was even scarier than the first one. And I love how it opens with a seance in Amityville, and it features the little boy from the now famous picture where the Warrens were investigating. It was after all the events of Amityville. The Lutzes had moved out, and the Warrens came in there to investigate, and they had a seance. So just seeing this little boy that I was so familiar with from this picture run around the Amityville house was a great treat for me, and I thought they handled it very well. A phenomenal set design, just like the first one, but just, again, I thought it was even better in this one. And 3 awesome horror villains. One of them turned out not to be much of a villain, but he was still very scary. Bill Wilkins, the old man. The Crooked Man was awesome. And Valak the Nun was an instant horror icon. It's one of those horror icons that makes you want to look at it and makes you want to turn away once you're looking at it. Again, just like with Sinister and just like with the original Conjuring, there's even less cursing in this than either Sinister or The Conjuring. Even less sex. And it's still rated R for content, and if you watch this movie you'll see why. The scares are so well crafted and with an emotional air about them and an air of authenticity. And I think I told you before, the reason why I'm so frightened by this film is because I explained this story on the podcast before where I've seen demons. There have been demons shown to me after I explored a haunted asylum. The next day I seen demons very clear in front of my face, and I'd never seen demons quite like that until I saw The Conjuring 2, when at the end, during the climax, when the nun turns into Valak and she has the demon face, tears came out of my eyes. I was so frightened because it looked just like those demons that I've seen in my face, and it's the only image that I've seen before or since that looks anything like those demons. I think that it's appreciated enough, but I think it should be even more appreciated, because I think this has the opposite effect of some films. Some films, like John Carpenter's early films, the casual horror fans just don't realize how great it is. It takes the hardcore horror fans or the cinephiles to realize that it's a classic. I think it's the opposite on this. A lot of casual horror fans are scared shitless by this, and they realize what an instant classic it is. But I think some of the more hardcore horror fans and some of the more cinephiles thinks this is too high budget, too polished, too much of a crowd pleaser to be considered a great cinematic achievement. 20 years from now, people are finally going to realize what a classic it is, and it probably will end up moving up my list even higher. But The Conjuring 2, I love it to death, and it's number 7 on my list.
The Conjuring 2 I prefer to the first one, and The Conjuring 2 doesn't really scare me or have the same effect on me that it has on you. But I think as a piece of filmmaking, it's underrated. It's probably one of the most immaculately crafted horror movies of the last 10 years. If you really look about the level of craftsmanship that went into it and the way that the cinematography builds tension and atmosphere, it's pretty astonishing filmmaking. The scene that I'm thinking of when I talk about the craft is where the ball comes out of the hallway, and there's this really, really long camera take where the camera's searching. The lighting is very, very dark, and the way that the ball just slowly rolls itself out there is almost incredible how well shot and how well plotted out and how well thought it is. And I think because it has a lot of crowd-pleasing aspects, people overlook how cinematic it actually is and how much it actually uses the art form of filmmaking to draw out very long, tense pieces of suspense that culminate in a big like that. Yeah. Really effective jump scares because they go on for so long and it becomes painful as you wait for the jump scare. Like, when is it going to come? When is it going to come? And it kind of puts you in the state of mind where it takes so long that you think it's not going to come anymore, and then it kind of relaxes you a little bit and you feel the tension ease. And just when you're starting to relax, that's when the jump scare comes and it jars you.
And I remember being very impressed by The Crooked Man. Mm-hmm. Because when I first watched the movie, I thought it was an impeccable film. But I remember thinking, the only complaint I could possibly have about this is a little bit too much CGI with The Crooked Man. And then I found out it's fucking real. It's a dude in makeup. And it's filmed in such a way where it looks otherworldly. It looks like it couldn't be achieved without a CGI. Because the actor that they used is real long and lanky, almost looks abnormal. And then the kind of costume they put on him looks kind of like... he kind of looks like the Willy Wonka character that they wanted for the Sinister movie. The way he moves and the shots that are chosen just looks like this creature that has to be cartoon because it can't be real, and come to find out it's real. So I'm very impressed by that part of it.
Right, we're getting high. My number 6 film is Alien from 1979, Ridley Scott's masterpiece. Why it's on my list? I think it's flawless in every aspect. There's not a single frame that is out of note, not one bum composition. I love the design of the ship because it seems very futuristic and practical at the same time. I feel like a lot of times when people are trying to design spaceships in movies, they want to make it look overly futuristic and super high-tech and clean. This does look like a futuristic spaceship, but it looks dirty and gritty, and it looks like a place where people have spent a long time working. There's a very tangible believability to it. It's not just the design of the ship, it's the design of the xenomorph himself, H.R. Geiger's unbelievable design. If you really think about aliens in movies prior to Alien, they all have a very similar look to them. There's almost like a cliched look of how an alien is, with the exaggerated head and the eye, and the way that the eyes are, the way that the body is almost humanoid. This one abandoned all the preconceived notions that people had about what aliens should look like and reinvents them from the ground up. The way that it looks is really hard to put into words because the design of the alien looks organic and biomechanic at the same time, and H.R. Geiger specialized in a type of art that was known as biomechanical surrealism. So the parts of the alien itself look like organic matter, and other parts of it look like something that was very designed, almost like the perfect killing machine. And it's the shape of the xenomorph's head is done like a phallus. So his head is a phallus, and the way that his mouth opens is supposed to represent a vagina. And I think that's what makes the design of the alien so unsettling, is that it mixes heavy elements of sexuality and both types of genitalia into something very horrifying. So there's something very psychosexual about the design of the alien itself. The movie has atmosphere to spare. It is creepy, like in every sense of the word, the way that it slowly builds its suspense, the way that the alien comes out. And I like the way that the alien is revealed very slowly. You only get glimpses of it here and there. You don't even get a good grasp on what the alien actually looks like because you only see parts of it here and there, but it looks real. And then when you actually see the full thing in design, it looks so awesome. And this is why CGI cannot substitute for practical works. If you look at the most recent Alien film, I already forgot the name of it. I didn't like it at all. We talked about it. I think it was Alien Resurrection. No, that's not it. Alien Covenant.
Yeah.
Alien Covenant.
Crap.
The aliens in there are so obviously fake and cartoon and CGI. Every scene with the alien in this movie, it looks like the actors are actually in the room with that fucking thing. It doesn't look like a faked out piece of anything. And it has my favorite jump scare in any horror movie. I kind of find that the most effective jump scares in horror movies are the ones that you don't expect to happen, kind of like the one in The Thing that I talked about earlier when he starts putting the hot needle against the blood. That one's effective because you don't see it, because you don't expect it to happen. This one has one of the best jump scares where one of the characters is crawling through the shafts and they know that the alien is moving towards him, and it builds up the suspense and it builds it, and you know that it's about to come at any second, but it comes a second too fast because you find yourself settling in to get ready for the jump scare, and like just when you've barely had enough time, the thing flashes before your eyes really fast and makes you jump. Best jump scare ever. Really excellent use of space. The way that everything looks in the movie, the aliens attacks, the way that you don't see it for long periods of time. And of course, Sigourney Weaver is a great protagonist. She projects strength and intelligence in this movie, and probably one of the most badass female characters, Ripley, in horror film history. It's equally great as a science fiction movie as it is as a horror movie. I feel like any list of the greatest science fiction films has to feature Alien, and any list of the greatest horror movies have to feature Alien. It feels like the horror is born out of the science fiction, and the science fiction is born out of the horror. And of course, the chest burster scene is legendary and hard to repeat.
It's been a while since I watched that one. I need to watch that one again because it's one of those where Aliens came out, and then that ended up being the one that was more rewatchable. But I think over the years I've grown to more like Alien more, so I need to go back and revisit that one.
Definitely.
All right, my number 6 is another haunted house film, but this one's still ahead of The Conjuring 2 because it's Poltergeist from 1982, another Tobe Hooper film. It's written by Steven Spielberg and Michael Grace, who went on to write Part 2 as well, which was also an excellent horror film. And too many people attribute this movie to Steven Spielberg because it does have a very Steven Spielberg feel to it. The family feels like him. Some of the bigger...
It's obviously from his imagination.
Yeah, some of the bigger effects belong to him, but this is very Tobe Hooper. Do not take this achievement away from him. He did accept a lot of input from Steven Spielberg, but Steven Spielberg did not direct it for him. It's about a family tormented by demonic spirits. It's the most endearing family in horror history. I still watch this movie to this day and I think, oh, they're so likable.
They kind of remind you of the family in E.T., don't they?
Yeah. And they're so cool, and you feel the love between them, and they feel real. Craig T. Nelson, JoBeth Williams, Dominique Dunn, Oliver Robbins, and Heather O'Rourke as Carol Ann. Just awesome horror family. And then, of course, the great Zelda Rubinstein as Tangina. Man, does she take this movie into another level. And then, of course, James Karen plays Mr. Teague, the ruthless real estate developer. Just a few of the many things that I love about this movie. Of course, the family. The way they have fun with the ghosts at first, and then it slowly becomes more and more sinister. It's very natural. The giant tree outside the little kid's window, and the clown as well. And those were both...
Oh, the clown is one of the creepiest things about it.
Yeah, the giant tree and the clown were both... Steven Spielberg came up with those because they were two of his biggest fears as a child. The big giant tree outside of his window and clowns. Carol Ann in the TV. And I love the part where the investigators come, and the family's trying to tell them how dire this is, and that the ghosts have their daughter. And then when that ghost first descends down that staircase, and it goes in very close to an extreme close-up of the investigator's face, there's fear and wonder in her.
You're listening to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
And of course, Tangina is one of the greatest things about it. The guy pulling his face off in the mirror, it's an iconic image. Craig T. Nelson screaming in the face of James Karen, asking him why he put their house and that whole real estate development on top of an Indian burial ground. The fear in James Karen's face is priceless in that, because you spend the whole movie seeing this family being scared by the ghosts. You're scared by the ghosts, and then you see the ultimate terror in the face of James Karen. It's because this desperate father who just went through this ordeal and he thought his family was going to die. You just seen the desperation and the fear on his face when he's screaming at James Karen. I thought it was a great way to end the movie. Just an all-time classic for many, many reasons, and that's why it's my number 6, Poltergeist, 1982.
Top 5. So my number 5 is the legendary The Shining from the great Stanley Kubrick, who just might be the greatest filmmaker in history, but that debate is for another day. Why is this in my top 5, and why is this one of the greatest horror movies of all time? And yes, this is one of the greatest horror movies of all time, not just one of my favorites. There's nothing else that exists like The Shining in history. It radiates not the same sense of evil that I get off of The Witch, but a sense of otherworldliness, of something very surreal. And I love that it's a haunted, kind of a haunted house movie, haunted hotel, whatever you want to call it, a haunted area. But the type of haunting that I get off of, the feeling that I get off of The Shining isn't of a house or a hotel being haunted by spirits. I get the feeling that the hotel itself is an entity and is a character, that the hotel itself is evil. And I love that it's never explained in the film what it is or why it's evil or what its motivations are, but you get it in every single frame. It is completely eerie from the opening scene to the last. You have Jack Nicholson in one of his greatest and most iconic performances. He's so over the top in this movie. He's so hammy and he's so ridiculous that there's something almost campy about his performance, in the same way that Piper Laurie is campy in Carrie. But at the same time, he's fucking insanely horrifying. Yeah. Because you can only imagine if you had somebody that batshit loony chasing you, especially if you're a little kid, it would be the worst feeling in the world. They're just images in The Shining that you cannot get out of your head, whether it's the iconic O'Grady twins saying, "Come play with us, Danny, forever and ever." It has of course, the naked lady in the bathroom that seduces Jack Nicholson, and then he realizes that he's making out with a rotting corpse, and the way that he backs away from the corpse, and the way that the camera follows him out, and the way that the camera switches to the point of view of that rotting old lady walking very slowly towards you while cackling, ha, 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 ha. And then you see Danny, interspersed with cuts of Danny shaking his head violently because he could sense what's going on, and the eerie music. There's never been anything else quite like that scene in horror history. Every time I see it, I get fucking chills. And I forget to mention how it's intercut with shots of the woman in the tub drowning and her body rising up out of the tub. Yeah. Nothing about that image makes sense at all. It feels like multiple things are going on at once that don't gel with each other, but does it get under your skin and does it creep you out. The movie is just shimmering with mood and style and atmosphere. And one of the coolest things about it is it's so bright and so cleanly lit. Most horror movies or haunted house movies try to emphasize the darkness or what you don't see in the corner, and that's how it draws out a lot of its suspense. You see everything in the hotel, and I think that's what gives it its very forlorn, almost lonely kind of quality that it has to it, the way that you could see everything so clearly. And it is, for my money, the ultimate haunted house picture. Kubrick only did one horror movie, but the one that he did is an absolute masterpiece, one of the pinnacles of the genre, one of my favorite horror movies of all time, one of my favorite movies of all time. Stanley Kubrick's masterful adaptation of Stephen King's The Shining is my number 5 horror movie of all time.
My number 5 is from 1999, The Blair Witch Project, simply because of this is so fucking scary. There's few times in my life where I've been as scared as this watching a movie. It's written and directed by Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez. It stars Heather Donahue, Michael C. Williams, and Joshua Leonard in excellent performances by all three. Very real to the point where it made everybody, including me, think it was real at the time.
I think everybody thought that was real when it came out. The marketing campaign was fucking genius.
And you can still see the authenticity of it. We already discussed this in our favorite films of the 90s, so I'll just go through a quick list of why I love this so much. All the stories from the documentary when it starts, all the stories that they tell themselves, and then the stories from the townspeople, the infighting among the characters, which was crafted in editing.
Nobody in this movie feels like they're acting out anything. It feels like you're just watching footage of people going into the woods and losing their minds and encountering something evil.
And these people that they're talking to in the town kind of conjure up your own image of the Blair Witch in your mind, and it never shows her, but you ever conjured in your mind, so that's scarier than anything they could have put on film. The children poking around in the outside of the tent, and you can kind of hear them out there, that was scared me shitless. And the fear in the eyes of the actors in so many scenes, that's one of the scariest things about this, is you can tell that those actors are genuinely scared out of their minds. When they find Josh's teeth, I love that whole scene. The snot scene when Heather says she's afraid to close her eyes and afraid to open them. Very authentically scary scene. And when they find the house, when they finally find the house where the Blair Witch is, and they're looking for Josh, and then she finds Mike standing against the wall, still gives me chills.
That is one of the greatest endings in horror movie history, because it doesn't really explain what happened, but you get the feeling that you're in the presence of the Blair Witch, and it just gives you chills when it ends. Just that very simple image of him standing up against the wall, almost like a child who was put in the corner, and then the sound of Heather screaming her head off.
I'll never forget that image, because you hear her screaming from the other side of the house because there's no sound on the camera that she has. So you hear her screaming through the other camera, and that's kind of creepy for some reason. And then you're kind of following the movements of the camera because you're kind of following her everywhere she goes. You're kind of in her shoes with her, and you're looking around the house for Josh, and you're looking around for Mike. And when she first comes around that corner and you see Mike standing there, it just it's scaring me right now. And when she first goes around the corner and sees Mike standing there, you know what's about to happen. And when it happens, it's still scary as hell. And you don't see what happens, you just see the camera hit the floor. Oh, so scary. The viewer's imagination wondering what is after them in the woods is actually scarier than if they would have showed it. And this is a movie where you must put yourself in the shoes of the actors. And this is another one where I understand why a lot of people hated it, because they just couldn't. It's too unconventional for them. They just couldn't put themselves in the place of these actors because it's just told through these couple cameras. And it's so loose the way it is because it's so improvisational. You have to put yourself in their shoes, and when you do, it will scare you to your core. And you'll never forget how much this movie frightened you, because I never will. And of course, it's the $60,000 budget, and most of it was marketing, and it made $250 million worldwide. A truly groundbreaking horror film that means a lot to the genre, and it reinvigorated a subgenre that's very oversaturated, but has really some great gems have come out of it, and that's why the Blair Witch Project is my number 5.
Great choice. My number 4 is Rosemary's Baby from 1968, the same year that gave us Night of the Living Dead, and it is the second appearance from Roman Polanski on my list. This is for me one of the all-time classic horror movies. I know that The Exorcist is probably a little bit scarier as a horror movie, but this one I find a little bit more involving on a personal level. It revolves around Rosemary Woodhouse and her husband Guy, who move into a new apartment in New York City, and they have these very friendly old neighbors that are next door. During the time that they're there, Rosemary gets pregnant and she's very happy, but you could tell that there's something very wrong going on in this apartment as these old people who are a little bit too friendly insinuate their way into Rosemary and Guy's life. It gets creepier and creepier as it unfolds. For a long while, it's another one of those horror movies that starts off very natural and almost seems like it might not be a horror movie, but there's little hints that give it away right off the bat, like the chanting that you hear coming from the other room, the suicide that happens early on in the movie. Mia Farrow is wonderful in the lead role. The movie has some of the best nightmare sequences I've ever seen put on film. They're both psychological and supernatural at the same time. Rosemary is raped by Satan himself, and the sequence where this happens, you see a visualization of nightmares she's having, of things in her past that she's a little bit ashamed and guilty of, interspersed with what is a satanic ritual. Masterfully directed by Roman Polanski. John Cassavetes, who is a filmmaker himself, playing Guy, is one of the greatest horror movie assholes in history. Any man that would allow his wife to be raped by Satan himself is a piece of shit. So I really hated his character, and the movie does a good job of really illustrating him as a very selfish, opportunistic piece of humanity. Ruth Gordon actually got nominated for an Oscar for her role as Minnie Castevet. This came out at a time with where feminism was booming and the women's lib movement was coming out. The movie is partially a metaphor for how society treats women, how they don't believe them when they tell their stories. One of the scariest things in the movie is how Rosemary comes to realize that there's a cult who is after her and her baby, and she tries to escape from it, but at every turn nobody believes her, and she's betrayed by somebody who she thinks she could trust, and you could tell they just think it's because she's some mad hysterical woman. It has my favorite ending in horror movie history when Rosemary walks up to the cradle and sees her baby for the first time, and I love that they don't show the baby, you just see Rosemary's reaction and the horrified look on her face. And it's a movie that I could return to time and time again. I still discover new things every time I see it. And for that reason, Rosemary's Baby is number 4 on my list. One of the great horror movies of all time and an all-time classic.
Yep, another masterpiece.
Yes.
And another masterpiece that's a little bit more fun and a lot less budget is written and directed by Sam Raimi.
I already knew what it was as soon as you said a lot less budget. Oh, man.
The Evil Dead from 1981. And this is the brainchild of Sam Raimi, of course, but it's also a huge collaboration between Bruce Campbell, Rob Tapert, Tom Sullivan, Ted Raimi, Ivan Raimi, and Scott Spiegel. If you read Bruce Campbell's book, If Chins Could Kill, he really breaks down everything they went through while filming this and some of their most interesting stories and how they achieved some of the things in this film. It's pretty amazing the more you learn about it. It's about 5 friends in a cabin and they get besieged by evil. Bruce Campbell as Ash, Ellen Sandweiss as Cheryl, Betsy Baker as Linda, Teresa Tilly as Shelley, and Richard DeManincourt as the douchebag Scotty. Just a few of the reasons why I love this movie. The demon POV from the woods is instantly iconic. I knew that
groundbreaking.
I knew that was going to be something that I was going to be remembering for the rest of my life. The cabin setting itself is awesome. The tapes that they find in the basement and listen to are creepy, and the Book of the Dead itself made out of human flesh. And when Cheryl first turns, when she's guessing the cards, that's probably one of the scariest scenes in horror history for me. And then Cheryl in the cellar, one of the creepiest images in horror history. And I love all the fake shemps, because a lot of the crew would stand in as demons because it was such a grueling shoot that some of the actresses just completely walked out. So they kind of had to finish off the movie with their what they call fake shemps, is when they take different crew, and a lot of the fake shemps were like Ted Raimi and Ivan Raimi, and even Tom Sullivan, the guy who did the makeup. So they would step in as the demons, and it made it kind of more off the wall. It kind of went with the aesthetic of the cabin coming to life. And the camera work, if you read Bruce Campbell's If Chins Could Kill, you really see how they did all the homemade camera rigs. Because this wasn't an expensive, it only had a $350,000 budget. But it actually looks really higher than that. It doesn't have a cheap quality to it, but the passion and the imagination went into it makes it seem like it's a bigger budget. Especially some of those shots of the demon POV going through the woods. It's just really impressive. But it's just a remarkable achievement and only a $350,000 budget, and still one of the greatest horror films ever made. Scary, funny, campy, one of the best times you'll ever have watching a horror movie. And that's why Evil Dead, number 4.
It's a masterpiece. I'll talk more about it in a little bit. But before I do that, my number 3 is Carrie, from 1976, Brian De Palma's adaptation of the classic Stephen King story. Anybody who listens to this podcast knows how much I love this movie and how much I've spoken about it. So I'm just going to talk about one aspect, and what the aspect of this movie that makes it one of the greatest. The extended prom sequence and everything after that at the ending. The prom sequence comes about, pretty deep into the movie, but it's very long and extended. And the way it plays out is incredible. The way that it's shot, the way that it's edited in the slow motion, the music that goes along with it is perfect. It goes back and forth between looking like a beautiful dream with these very exaggerated, saturated blues that seem to glow and make you feel like you're entering a fairy tale world. It puts you in the world of Carrie herself, the magic she must feel to have a life where she's been treated by shit, both in school and in her home life, and for once to feel special is magical the way that it plays out. And in another movie, it would have just been a beautiful scene. The scene where she dances with Tommy, you see the camera spinning around them really slowly as they dance and waltz, and this really beautiful song is playing, and slowly it gets faster and faster, and you're caught up with Carrie. You're right there with her. You feel like you are dizzy and falling in love and feeling what it feels like for the first time to have fun or to have any sort of joy in your life. And then the way that that it cuts back and forth between that and the more tense images. The more tense images of the movie are filmed with a different color filter, while the nice parts of the prom sequence are all this very exaggerated dreamlike blue. The horror parts are a very harsh, mean-looking red, and it has a different score when it cuts to the parts where it's just it's very clear that something awful is about to happen. So it builds up tension for a very long time. You get to feel like you're caught between a beautiful, almost orgasmic dream and a nightmare where everything goes completely wrong. When she goes up on the stage, Bucket of Blood comes out is played for maximum suspense. The way that the music keeps building, the way that it goes in slow motion, you could see the beautiful look on Sissy Spacek's face as she feels special for the first time in her life. And then the blood comes down, the room goes silent, and all you could hear is just the sound of the bucket just swinging back and forth, very quiet, and you see the horrified look on Carrie's face. And then you start to see hallucinations that she's having, imagining everybody laughing at her or mocking her pain and her grief. These images are not real, but they come from very real things that happened in her past, and this was enough to make her mind just snap. It triggered the worst parts of her personality. When she gets pissed off, the colors turn a really harsh red, and a lot of it is Sissy Spacek's acting. You register the hate and the anger she feels towards everybody.
What's more devastating than the kills themselves is just the empathy you have for Carrie. I don't feel the impact of all the deaths as much as I do the impact that it has on her. That she went to a place that she can never come back from. She just brutally slaughtered
everybody,
a bunch of people. That was more devastating to me than the actual kills. Knowing that this innocent, traumatized girl just went far beyond
what she was and never coming back.
Yeah.
Listen to this podcast, or I'll make a jack-o'-lantern out of your best friend's head.
Number 3, The Exorcist from 1973. You already mentioned this on your list. Directed by William Friedkin and written superbly by William Peter Blatty, who also wrote the novel. It's about a 12-year-old girl who fights a demonic possession, and the narrative is split between her and a priest who doubts his faith while his mother is dying. All of it very emotionally engaging, very dramatic. Linda Blair and Ellen Burstyn shine here as the daughter and the mother. Jason Miller is absolutely awesome as Father Karras. I love his performance in this, one of the greatest ever in horror. Max von Sydow as Father Marin, the older priest.
He was actually in a lot of Ingmar Bergman movies before. He was a Swedish actor. That's mostly what he's known for, is being part of Ingmar Bergman religious anguish films. He was always dealing with some sort of religious anguish. Like in The Seventh Seal, which kind of makes it perfect casting to have him.
And a kind of an understated character in this is Lieutenant William Kinderman, played by Lee J. Cobb. I love his character because he not only brings kind of almost a comic relief to such a heavy, dramatic film, he also brings some of the fear and some of the emotion to it, especially toward the end. He's very inconspicuous about it. You never know quite what he's saying. He's one of those characters where he's saying one thing to the priest, but you're not sure the context of exactly what he's really saying. And he kind of keeps that dynamic through the whole thing, and I think it's very effective for the overall story. And of course, this is a bona fide masterpiece, undeniable. Superior makeup effects from Dick Smith. The slow burn drama and the character development is off the charts. There's evil brewing throughout, just like I said, from the opening scene, and then you feel that same evil rise up again in a completely different situation when the girl's possessed at the end. The green vomit spewing.
Iconic.
Yeah, your mother sucks cocks in hell.
Shut up, or I'll rip your lips off.
The demon makeup is amazing. One of the most satisfying climaxes in horror. It's an excellent mixture of layered drama, religious melodrama, slow burn atmosphere, and gut-wrenching terror, and it all culminates in this awesome climax, and it gets better with repeat viewings. It was number 1 on my list for a while, but it did go down slightly because I watched it a couple years ago on big screen in digital, fully remastered, and it just didn't have the same aesthetic to me. It was too
clean.
Yeah, too clean. It took some of the life out of it, but I still love the movie. It's still extremely effective. Undeniable classic, and that's why The Exorcist is number 3 from 1973, year after I was born.
One of the all-time masterpieces. So my number 2 is The Evil Dead from 1981, Sam Raimi's masterpiece.
Yes.
So I have a very personal connection to this one. This is the first movie to have ever scared me. I loved horror movies as a child. I was obsessed with them, but I was a weird kid. They never scared me. I just found them fascinating and I couldn't stop watching them. The Evil Dead was a completely different beast. I'd never seen anything so forcefully demented, something so forcefully wicked, and I don't think I'd ever felt a horror film pummelly the way that The Evil Dead did. And I will never forget the first time I saw the movie. The pencil stabbing scene where she gets stabbed fucking shocked me so much, and I remember as a little kid being so horrified, I was shaking. And as I sat there, the movie started scaring me. I never felt that feeling before, but I liked it because I was like, oh my god, this is the feeling that people talk about when they say they're scared of horror movies. That movie made me discover it. I watched it with my dad, and he always said if I was afraid of the movie or afraid of anything, he was very open. He would just tell him, and he would turn it off, and he would take it off. It was something I didn't enjoy. I was on the verge of telling him I was scared, but there was no way I couldn't finish that film, so I stuck it out. I toughed it out, my little 6-year-old self. And man, I'm glad I did. That movie has meant so much to me throughout the years. It still holds up for me. It's obviously not as scary as the first time I saw it as a child. Nothing's ever going to replicate that experience. I'll never be able to recreate that again. But it's still so fucking effective to this day. And what I find interesting about it is there are aspects of it that are a little bit cheesy, a little bit corny, and kind of dated. But it doesn't take away from how brutally punishing all of it is. It is so forceful in the way that it's made. Just those PFV camera shots where it's the demon's perspective. The way that it's not just a gliding camera. The camera is moving chaotically and violently. The way that a demon would chase after you. It's such an aggressive piece of filmmaking in terms of the editing and the music. And God, this has the best sound design of any horror movie in history. You could close your eyes and not look at a single fucking thing in this movie, and the sounds and the voices of the demons would frighten you.
Yeah.
It's such a forceful little piece of filmmaking. It has a blast of pure horror creativity through and through. Some of it's cheesy and you could laugh at, but it's one of those things that's so cheesy, but at the same time it's so forcefully demented. They work so hard to make it wicked and demented that you might laugh at it and giggle at it, but then be horrified by it at the same time.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know of any other film that could make me smirk at its cheesiness, but still make me feel like I'm watching something really authentically wicked.
Yeah.
It's really exciting, it moves really fast, and it pummels the viewer. There's nothing else like the demons in The Evil Dead. And I'll be honest with you, they scare me a lot more than Reagan does in The Exorcist. All the demons and the voices that are in here really get under my skin. So many indelible images in that movie, so many great scenes where there's the Jack of Diamonds, Ace of Spades, where Cheryl guesses the cards, the transformations of the people, the makeup, which is really crude, is so effective. All the camera angles, the shots, the zooms.
On the ankle stab with the pencil.
Yeah, the ankle stab. That's what I was talking about earlier. I remember seeing that for the first time vividly and being so shocked by what I'd seen, because no other horror movie did this to me before The Evil Dead, so it holds a very special place in my heart. Aside from my nostalgia from it, it's still a fucking masterpiece. It is a marvel of low-budget filmmaking. The amount of energy and excitement and pure joy that went into making something in the service of just scaring the fuck out of you. I can show it to people to this day, even if I see people when I show it to them who've never seen it before, they giggle for a while, they think it's cheesy, but once the horror kicks in, the looks are always the same. People look absolutely astonished by what they are watching. So the sounds, the imagery, everything about The Evil Dead makes it horror perfection in my book. Just one of the absolute greatest horror movies of all time. One of my favorite movies of all time, period, of any genre. Marvelous piece of filmmaking. I really love Sam Raimi, and I love the whole Evil Dead trilogy, and I think you could tell by how excited I'm getting talking about it. And Evil Dead 2 is great. Army of Darkness is great. I love Drag Me to Hell. I even really am a big fan of especially his first two Spider-Man movies.
Yeah.
But for my money, Sam Raimi never repeated what he did with The Evil Dead. That is something that is so singular, so original, can never be topped, can never be repeated. For all these reasons and for how excited it gets me when I talk about it, The Evil Dead comes very close to being my favorite horror film of all time. One of the all-time greats. Love it, love it, love it, love it.
Cool, and still very impressive camera work to this day.
Oh man,
I don't know camera work in many horror films that's that good and that's inventive.
A feat of ingenuity and inventiveness.
All right, that brings us to my number 2. This is one that I went back and forth at the top of my list along with The Exorcist for the longest, but now it's down to number 2, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre from 1974.
I'm baffled. I have no idea what your number 1 is going to be. Oh wait.
It's directed and co-written by Tobe Hooper and written by Kim Henkel. The standouts are, of course, Marilyn Burns as Sally, just an iconic performance from her. Paul Partain as Franklin, the douchebag brother in the wheelchair.
One of the most irritating characters in horror film history.
Edwin Neal as the hitchhiker. Bill Mosely kind of beat him out in this one and made that character even better, but it still doesn't take away from how great he was in this, especially the part where they pick him up in the van. Jim Sydow, of course, is the old man who has a bigger part in part 2, and the great Gunnar Hansen as Leatherface, unprecedented.
Very unique
horror
performance.
villain. Yes, and you feel like you know his past by the way he moves and the way he kills, and it's a simple story that's barely a story, but just the way it plays out is highly effective and very riveting. And you feel like there's more of a story there, just like The Blood. You feel like there's more of a story there than there is, and you feel like there's more blood there than there is, but there's not much. I love the banter between the characters in the beginning. It's borderline meaningless, but it's also existential, and it kind of adds to the aesthetic of the movie, I think. The disturbing set design that you mentioned, it goes hand in hand with the score, and both of them were very homemade, and you can tell. Mm-hmm. Where Tobe Hooper made all this furniture himself with real animal bones and just any kind of weird looking thing he could see laying around. He just tied it together and made furniture and stuff out of it. And
great use of props.
Yeah, and he used that same concept with the homemade score, which is a bunch of bones clanging together, and I think that's an old camera sound. Like,
but it has a way of slicing through your eardrums that kind of like draws you up into an agitated frame of mind while you're watching it.
And this, along with many other things, combined for a thick atmosphere and dread throughout the whole movie. And then Leatherface provides some of the best jump scares ever in horror. And the hanging on the hook scene is one of the most disturbing. And like you said, you feel like you've seen her being hung on that hook, but you don't.
No.
And it looks very painful, and your heart breaks for the girl. The dinner scene is classic for a reason, and another iconic climax with Marilyn Burns and her performance reaching completely insane levels.
Hysterical.
I mean, even outside of it being a movie, I thought I was seeing an actress lose her mind. Mm-hmm. I mean, she looked like she physically lost her mind.
The actors were starting to lose their mind, according to most stories about the making and the production of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The heat and the awful smell. I can only imagine what it would be like to be an unbearable heat with a rancid smell enveloping you at all times.
Yeah, and all that homemade furniture was just festering in the sun and smelling. I don't know how they didn't get some kind of disease making that thing.
And you could feel the disease burn into the film print itself. It feels like ugly and dirty when you're watching it.
And like you said, almost no blood, but it feels very brutal and very disturbing. And you feel every bit of the brutality that's in here, and you feel like you see it, but you really don't. And that's the genius of this movie and the genius of the great Tobe Hooper. And that's why he's been on my list a few times. And that's why his masterpiece, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is way up at number 2 for me.
A great film.
You're listening to Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show Podcast.
Now, I hesitate to name my number 1 film because it's so cliched, but I want to do it justice just because I love it. My number 1 horror film of all time, is Halloween from John Carpenter.
Cool.
And why this is my number 1? This is, for me, for my money, it is the most pure horror movie in existence. I think that there's a lot of horror movies that have more layers to it and have a little bit more involving drama, something say like The Exorcist. But the way that this movie reduces horror to its most spare and basic elements is kind of genius. The story itself is very simple. It's nothing more or less than an escaped madman stalking a group of babysitters and killing them one by one. Now, there's not really much going on as far as the script goes, but it's a perfectly realized style. Michael Myers is, for me, the greatest horror movie villain for a couple of reasons. One, he doesn't have any personality. He's a little bit of a blank slate. There's no psychological profile there, and there is no motivation behind his killings whatsoever. He becomes the perfect blank slate upon which the audience could pin all their subconscious fears. By representing nothing, he represents everything evil, the embodiment of pure evil, without purpose, without meaning. And then Jamie Lee Curtis as as Laurie Strode. You get the sense that she's a very good person, a decent human being. She's very shy, she's painfully awkward, and in her circle of friends, she's obviously the dorkiest and the one who doesn't get dates with boys, the most studious member of that group. In the early parts of the movie, when she's just being stalked by Michael Myers and she's hanging out with her friends, you get the sense of a teenager who's very uncomfortable in her own skin and doesn't have a whole lot of self-confidence. Underneath it all, you could see that she's a good person. She is the pure personification of good, squaring off against the pure personification of evil. The film's brilliance is in the elegance of the film's simplicity and Carpenter's masterful use of widescreen compositions. Dean Cundy's cinematography puts a lot of emphasis on its color scheme. Because this is supposed to take place in Haddonfield, Illinois during the autumn on October. It was actually shot in the summer in Southern California, and the summer in Southern California looks nothing like Illinois looks in the autumn. All the grass is ultra green in the movie, the leaves are really green, so it doesn't do a good job of capturing what autumn in Illinois is actually like. So since Dean Cundy knew that he wasn't able to capture something realistic, he did something very interesting when he started to do the color grading. All of the daytime scenes were pushed extremely far to the oranges, and the nighttime scenes are pushed very far to the blues. It's unnatural and it doesn't really represent reality, but it contributes to the film's dreamy, fairy tale-like quality. It's not what autumn really looks like in Illinois, it's more of a dream of what autumn looks like in Illinois. The very simple, elegant compositions help to make the horror really spare. One of the best scenes in horror movie history is when Jamie Lee Curtis realizes that all of her friends are dead and she's alone in an abandoned house with a bunch of dead bodies and all the lights are off. She's standing up against the wall, and next to her is a door frame with nothing there but pure black, so you see nothing but black, and she's crying there, and slowly Michael Myers' face emerges, that infamous William Shatner mask. You see this little white materialize out of the black, and the way that it comes out is fucking stunning. Michael Myers is the boogeyman incarnate, and I like that the film strips everything out of it but the fact that he's the boogeyman, and by not giving him a psychological profile, he's more horrifying because you can't explain anything about him. He doesn't even make sense as a person. There's something very irrational about Michael Myers. He killed his older sister when he was 6 years old for no reason, had a normal good childhood, snapped, and after he killed his sister, he never spoke a single word again. No amount of psychological profiles or abusive childhoods could ever tap into what a blank slate could tap into, and I feel like the William Shatner mask contributes to it because it's very blank, bland features where Michael Myers, you could pin all your fears on this one character in the way that he moves. A lot of the scenes are really beautiful. I think the scene where Michael Myers stabs somebody up against the cabinet in the kitchen and he just tilts his head very childlike back and forth. The way that he's observing his handiwork reminds me of what a kid does or what a psycho would do, a little kid, if he killed a bunch of butterflies and were admiring his collection. There's something very pure about all the imagery in this movie, the way that it's as pure of a horror movie as you can get is Halloween. The other big contributing factor is the music, the score that John Carpenter has. It is the best score in horror history. I'm sure a lot of people would agree with me about that. That is one of the most iconic, creepiest movie scores in history. It's instantly memorable. If you only heard that score once, it would forever be burned into your head. The opening scene is incredible. The one long camera take where you're experiencing the world through Michael Myers' eyes as a child. There's a lot of other horror slashers. I love A Nightmare on Elm Street, like I said, and I'm a big fan of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but I don't think any other of those slasher movies is as perfect as Halloween is. And another interesting thing about it is, even though it's a slasher, it feels vaguely supernatural. Absolute masterpiece and one of the greatest films ever made. Halloween, John Carpenter, my number 1 horror film of all time.
And Donald Pleasance makes you feel like Michael Myers is supernatural.
See, that's another thing. I keep forgetting about all these things. That's a big contributing factor, the way the speeches that Donald Pleasance gives, and some of it's kind of hammy and a little bit over the top. but it works because it looks like he believes every word that comes out of his mouth. Yes.
Another one that's a bona fide classic for a reason is my number one, The Shining from 1980. This has been one of my favorite horror films. I watched it at age 9. I've watched it several times since then, and I just like it more and more each time I watch it.
That's another movie where I feel it's every bit as perfectly designed as Halloween in a different way.
It's directed and co-written by the great Stanley Kubrick and co-written by Diane Johnson based on a Stephen King novel, fairly loosely based. It's not a great Stephen King adaptation, but it's a wonderful film, one of the best and my absolute favorite. Very obvious that it's one of the great masters of cinema who decided to do a horror film, and you can see it with every frame. As great as Blair Witch is as an example of what a low-budget horror film can do, this is just a great example of what a big-budget horror film can do, and what a true master can do when he has the money to do it. Jack Nicholson is wonderful, of course, as Jack Torrance. Shelley Duvall in an insane performance as Wendy. Danny Lloyd as Danny is awesome performance with the 80 takes that Kubrick would put him through, just nailing it. Scatman Crothers, I've always loved him as Halloran. Joe Turkel as Lloyd and Philip Stone as Grady. Now the main horror villain in this may be Jack Nicholson as Jack Torrance, but for me the real fear comes from the ghost in this hotel, and the face put on these ghosts is Joe Turkel as Lloyd and Philip Stone as Grady. Both very effective.
Aren't those some of the eeriest ghosts you've ever seen in a movie?
Yeah, very cryptic in where they speak.
The way that they speak, they have a very slow manner of speaking, and they're very proper in their speech too. Like they're speaking in perfect English with perfect grammar, and there's something very almost soothing and insinuating about the way that they speak. Yeah. They seem almost mesmerizing.
And I love the hotel itself, just the whole design of it, and the fact that, like I said, I watched this when I was a little kid, and it wasn't until I got older that I found out that it was a set, and I still couldn't believe it. After I found out it was a set, I went back and watched it again, and there's not one indication that this is a set at all. It looks like a hotel in the middle of a blizzard. And especially in the opening scenes when they first get to the hotel, and they're walking past those big, huge windows that are from ceiling to floor, and you see the blinding snow outside, and you find out that was just lights. It wasn't snow at all outside the window. It's just amazing to me. The winter setting, the maze, the carpet design, the Grady twins, the blood coming out of the elevator, red rum, Jack tearing down the door with an axe, the old lady in the tub that we talked about, Jack typing all work no play into his typewriter.
How many scenes in this movie are iconic? I feel like everything that you've named has been parodied or done in pop culture. And you're forgetting, here's Johnny.
Yeah.
That's another one. Probably the most famous part of it. Or the Grady twins. Actually, I don't know which one's more famous. Here's Johnny or the Grady, or Come Play With Us, Danny.
And out of all those iconic scenes, my favorite scene of the whole movie is when Jack is trapped in the refrigerator. Wendy kind of outsmarted him and kind of trapped him in there. So he's in there hopeless. You don't think he's ever going to get out, and then you hear the voice on the other side of the door, and it's of Grady. So Grady's on the other side of the door, and up to this point, you think that maybe, just maybe, these ghosts are in Jack's head the entire time. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget the moment when you first hear that click and that refrigerator door opens.
And you realize it's not in his head.
Yeah, and you realize the implications of what that means. Do you realize that when you hear that click and that door opens, that means that those ghosts are not only real, but they can physically manifest themselves and get him out of this, and the purpose of opening it so he could get out and kill his family. It's just amazing.
I like it too because it's just as psychological as it is supernatural. Like you said earlier, for a long time, even with the strange things that Danny sees, you think maybe this is directed in such a way that maybe this is just inside their head. And the moment that you realize, oh no, this is actually happening, it's not inside their head, it gets even creepier. And I think what makes it scarier is that it's not the ghosts themselves that are physically trying to harm Jack's family. It's the fact that they are using a human conduit, the head of the household. Yeah. You're supposed to, as a little child, you look up to your father, and that's somebody that you don't think of chasing you down to kill you, or you don't think your husband is going to be tearing down your door with an axe. And I think they do that on purpose because it's more effective to kill these people using somebody that they love and they care about, it makes the horror more horrifying than if it's just ghosts trying to scare you. It's like, these ghosts aren't trying to kill them. They are trying to drive Jack to the point of insanity that he takes it out himself. So that's what makes it such a unique haunted house movie. It's just like, nah, we're going to get inside this guy's head and we're going to make him carry out all our deeds, even though we could physically manifest ourselves.
Yeah.
It gives an extra layer of menace. And every aspect of this movie radiates a very otherworldly quality. I can't quite put into words, but there's something very cold and inhuman. You feel like you are stuck inside a cold and inhuman entity every time you're inside the Overlook Hotel. There's something about the way that it looms in every shot. Well, the type of filmmaking that's so effective, and you can't even put your word on why it's effective. Just a scene where Jack Nicholson is talking to Grady in the restroom.
Yeah.
And it's just very quiet, and they're just slowly talking to each other. But it makes you feel this sense of dread and a sense of evil.
Because he's having a casual conversation with a spirit. Someone that's clear that it's either a spirit or a figment of his imagination. And both are scary concepts.
And the conversation only gets more menacing the longer it goes on.
And I love the acting performances from all three of the main characters. You can tell it's very visible that they were pushed almost to the point of insanity, especially the two adults. Not so much the boy. You can see it in the layers of the performance of the boy, but you can really see the insanity come out in both Jack and Wendy.
Poor Shelley Duvall. We know that Kubrick terrorized her on the set, and she looks terrorized.
And you can tell that, because let's face it, Shelley Duvall is not one of our greatest actresses, but he pulled one of the great performances out of her by emotionally draining her. Because Kubrick had a way to push actors, push them even more until they went over the edge, and then keep pushing them until their performance became something else entirely than what they set out to do in the first place. And that's why he's one of our greatest filmmakers. And not to mention the cinematography from John Alcott is just superb from beginning to end.
We haven't even talked about the Steadicam shots which were groundbreaking as it follows Danny around the hotel. And there's something very hypnotic going on if you pay attention to it. It's almost subconscious. The way that he's rolling around on his little bike and it goes over the carpet and it makes a muffled sound, and then it hits the cardboard and makes a sound, and then it gets muffled again. And looks like he's going in a circle, but even though he's going in a circle, he's never going into the same room. It looks like he's entering different layers of the house, and it doesn't make sense. You're like, why would he be going higher and higher and higher? He's just going in a circle. There's something very dreamlike and hypnotic in the way that scene is directed.
And you feel like every corner that he turns, you feel like something horrific is going to be around that corner until there finally is. One of the greatest slow burns horror films ever made. But it's still highly entertaining with excellent. The story beats are very entertaining and keep you engaged through the whole thing.
It's slow, but it's never remotely boring.
Yeah. And plus the visuals and the score on top of it, it's an amazing mixture of multiple elements orchestrated to perfection by Kubrick. That's the best way I can put it. And it's my most watched horror film from childhood to adulthood to a filmmaker. As a child, I watched it with wonder because of the images, because of the crazy wild man running around after his family, and just the whole batshit insanity of it. And then when I became an adult, I started seeing more of the nuances of it, more of the dramatic part of the movie started hitting me harder. And then when I became a filmmaker, I could analyze it and deeply analyze it, every single scene, and it holds up. And it's worth discussions. It's worth watching multiple times. It's worth appreciating on a different level each time you watch it. And it's just a masterpiece that's always fun to watch, and it's not often that masterpieces are this fun to watch.
Yes.
And that's why The Shining is my #1 film of all time.
Fantastic choice, Michael. The Shining arguably deserves a higher spot on my list, but judging as horror movies as opposed to films, I put a few things higher. At the same time, I could totally see this easily taking a #1 spot, and it's totally deserving of the spot that it has on your list. It is one of the ultimate examples of the horror genre is Stanley Kubrick's The Shining.
And I think you'll agree that both of our top 10s, any film on our top 10 could easily move up to #1.
Yeah, I think so. I think
That
so.
all of them are. That's how much I love horror. Before we go, thank you for sticking around with us for this marathon long podcast. This 2-part podcast is going to end up being, what, 4 to 6 hours?
Altogether? Probably
Yeah.
about 6 hours.
So I hope you guys enjoy it. We enjoy doing it. And don't forget to check out our variety show on the American Horrors channel. We are coming back for the end of the season on December 13th. That's going to be Friday the 13th. We're going to have 3 episodes at the end of the season, and they're both going to be packed full of stuff, and I think you're going to love it. And I think you're going to love a lot of the cool stuff that's coming up. So check out all the updates on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Pickles Horror Show, or on Instagram @Pickles Horror Show.
Well, until next week, folks,
Happy
happy horror.